Anybody
Yes.
count?
Now we're live streaming. Ah, Senator Hutchings is here.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to call the roll.
Okay, please do.
Senator Anderson,
Senator Anderson here.
Senator Hutchings,
Hutchings here.
Senator Pappas,
Pappas is here. He's trying to get his camera going.
Senator Steinmetz. Here. Representative Blake,
Here.
Representative Brown,
Here.
Representative Crank,
Here.
Representative Louts,
Here.
Representative McGuire,
Present.
Representative Newsom. Here. Representative Obermuller.
He must be excused.
Oh, yes, excuse, he'll get here. I'm pretty sure. I just don't know where he is right now.
Representative Western. Co-Chairman Eklund,
Here.
Co-Chairman Von Flater.
Here. So we have a quorum. I can see everybody on the screen except for Representative Obermuller. So anybody have any comments to make before we start the meeting? Okay. We'll start with Director Reiner. Would you, Mary Beth or somebody, whoever's running the room, would they let them in, please? There's Shelby, I see her, and there's Mr. Director Reiner, I see him. Director Reiner, are you ready? Everybody else will just mute and we'll have Director Reiner speak at this point.
Good morning, Chairman and members of the committee. A fine day to you. Hey, thanks for letting us be here today. Look forward to spending the day to you with you. Hey, in terms of opening comments and sort of orientation to the day, I thought we'd start with really a quick summary of some relevant topics that we've talked about in the past that we would not be talking about today. You should have, I hope, a PowerPoint presentation in front of you. The first one that I'd like to go over with you is Director's opening remarks, and I'd ask you to turn to page 1. I'll just give you just a little bit to get there. And I'll tell you, as we start down the day, I would certainly start by saying, hey, thank you for the 2020 legislative session. It really didn't end that long ago, but it seems like with this COVID and what we've been going through, that it has been a while. But there is a lot of focus by many of you to push through the bills that we worked on in 2019, and that is greatly appreciated. Hey, let me talk to you about our current operational focus. As we have worked through this COVID, and as we have worked to ensure that WYDOT remains, really good at what it does, our focus has remained on employees. So we did. I did start when I came over here doing really 2 town halls a year, and we went into our first town hall just as it was planned in the spring. And so we did it in March, and it just so happened to be, and actually it's early April, and it really happened to coincide with this COVID, which really worked out really well. So we did it all remotely. We used Google Hangouts. We had some up to about 200 was the most people we had on at any one time, but it was a great way to spend some time talking to the employees of this organization. And I'll tell you more about that during the COVID update. Certainly, we've stood up some advisory teams. Those continue to go well. and we focused on, again, safety during the coronavirus environment. But we'll talk to you more about that during the coronavirus. I'll skip over, certainly COVID has been a focus, but we've got a whole block on that. So I'll skip over that, as I'll skip over alternate revenue sources, because that's been a focus, and I'll report to you on that later today. The other thing I would highlight is that your Wyoming Department of Transportation is now in sort of summer mode, and we have as of today, what your slide says is 61 construction projects on the 5th of May. Today we're at 64, and those are going very well. Now I'll tell you that in this coronavirus environment, we've had to modify how we're doing some of the construction projects. Some states around us actually shut down their construction projects, which we did not see as helpful for us as a state. And we made the decision that we would continue with construction projects. We saw it important to the economic stimulus of the state, and also our construction season is short, and we've got to make the most of it as that we can. And so, my thanks to Shelby Carlson and Katie Legursky in working together, between us and the Associated General Contractors, issued a joint letter that said, here's how we'll respect each other in a construction environment. Here's when we're going to wear masks. Here's how we're going to handle material that we have to pass back and forth. Here's how we're going to protect ourselves when we got to huddle over the hood of a pickup and look at plants. And those have been well received, well implemented, and we're off to a great construction season. And so my thanks to those who were involved in that. We did have snowplows, and we've talked snowplows that got hit, and we have talked about that in the past. The actual final number for the year, we're standing at 27. The report says 25. It's been adjusted up just a little bit. So, estimated repair costs, almost $1 million. And here's how that process works, right? Is the accident report comes in from the district. We send it down to risk management, because remember, we're self-insured as a state. Then basically we get a ticket number, and all the repairs get done. Then we submit the repairs and the cost back down to risk management. They cut us a check, and then they pursue the insurance company if whoever hit us. So it is a long process in terms of getting that money back. I'm really interested in reducing those number of strikes. I've talked to you about connected vehicles before. I do see that as a mechanism. This year, we actually tried putting up signs on the digital message signs that says snowplow operations, in the area. We did that sort of late in the season, just in one day. I was just sort of frustrated about, the number of hits, and start looking at, all right, what else can we do? And that's one of the items we added. So we'll continue to track that and work that, but that certainly is out there. Maybe two other things that I would add to this sort of my focus before we go to the next slide. We are spending a lot of time working budget, and I don't think that would surprise you. And our budget work is really largely along two lines. One is, as you well know from being on this committee, we've been chronically short for a while. And so that has led us to start the process of adjusting the STIP. And we're in that process. We should have that done here in a couple of weeks and letters out. But that adjustment has been because we are enforcing the asset preservation approach, which means some projects will just need to be pushed to the right. And so we're in the process of adjusting our plan to do that. The other portion of the budget that we're adjusting is really caused by COVID. And I'll walk you through that when we get to that portion of today's brief. But there's a fiscal hit to WYDOT based on people not traveling and our revenue coming from fuel tax. And so we are having to take some steps to ensure that we balance our budget, because really, we project revenues and then we plan to spend all those revenues. It's money in, money out, and so we'll have to adjust that. So that's taken some time. We've got more meetings. In fact, we have a meeting scheduled with the governor tomorrow to sort of talk over some options. Then the other thing I'd brief you on relative to this would be a hiring freeze. So we certainly have a hiring freeze that's in place. Now, the way that's been put into place is that the governor has authorized directors to make the decision at our level and then push it up to A&I HRD for their approval. And the decision at our level is whether we hire somebody or not, because we do have authority to hire if it meets health, safety, and welfare of the organization, because this will go on for a long time, and it is, I think it's key that we maintain operational capability of the organization, right? It doesn't do us any good not to have any snowplow drivers. And so in case of a snowplow driver, we're going to delay hiring those. So if somebody leaves and you're a snowplow driver, we'll probably hire you back in August. So we got you trained up for the next fall. And so that's been our approach, is an individual analysis of each position that needs to be filled. And there are certainly some that we are not, and we'll just assume some organizational risk. All right, that's the first slide. Let me move to the second slide then. And that's a quick update on WyoLink, because I know that you're really—
Dr. Reiner, could we ask if there's any questions from the committee? Seeing none, please continue.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just update you quickly on WyoLink. And I'll tell you, as I keep watching this system, my sense is it continues to evolve into an excellent interoperable system that is working very well for us across the state. Couple examples, since really we talked to you the last time, we did have a couple big crashes out on the interstate. In fact, on the 20th of February, Carbon County, 70 vehicles, 3 fatalities, unfortunately, right? And but as you do the forensic, and we do that after a big event like this, pull everybody and say, hey, what went right, what didn't go right? And one of the things that went really right was we had 25 disparate agencies all responding to that pileup, which was out really in the red desert. There's nothing there, and people had to come from a long distance, and it was all coordinated through WyoLink and it worked perfectly. Increase of 15,000 calls over that short time frame. And the system held together, and it's a good thing, and it was a good test for it. And then again, we had the same thing in Laramie County with some smaller vehicles, but again, the system worked good. And so that's really, I think, the message that I try to relay is, hey, listen, in terms of the ability to be an interoperable system between agencies, which is how that was designed, that is working well. In terms of tower build out, Buffalo is up and running, and the Highway Patrol has said, hey, thank you, because they can tell a big difference. Orange Junction should be operational here, lickety split, right? The same way, and the other 13 towers are moving right along. And I'll tell you that as you're well aware of, the county commissioners have said, hey, we're really interested in how we fund the maintenance. Mr. Chairman, let me just stop there and see if there's any questions on that slide.
Yes, Representative Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Reiner, those remaining 13 towers, how many more towers do we have to put up after those 13, or is that going to be it? And could I also get a map of those 13 remaining sites? Thank you.
Director Reiner.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Blake, so yes, you can get a map. In fact, I see Troy Babbitt's on, so he's taking a note. He'll get you that map. In terms of how many more towers, we had originally planned for 2, one in Baggs and one north of Sheridan, and those ones I think we'll put on hold. And so that's how many we had at the current time. there has been some discussion about trying to, penetrate more down into the tactical side. If that decision is made locally, then you could put up some more towers. We're pretty happy with where it's at right now. The discussion always is you get the results of what you put in, and where we're at is this 13 tower build out really completed where we wanted to get to. I certainly would not push back terribly on 2 more in those 2 locations I talked about. It is all based on revenue.
So Director Reiner, are you speaking of only the whole state is covered by these towers?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, when you start looking at the state, what you quickly see is when you do the broad brush, what we say is we're covered over 98% of the state. When you start paring down into a couple of these more isolated areas, there's still pockets of areas that don't work. Remember that when this system was first put in, that it was put in to cover roads and safety on roads. It has now morphed right into well more than that. And so in my mind, it becomes one of those, in the end, this will become, and I don't know if we want to get into that discussion today, and maybe we need to schedule it for later, but it becomes a policy decision on, hey, what exactly do we want this system to be? As I've started to think about it and think about this system, and listen to some of the testimony that was at the last legislature, it really struck me that there's almost, when you get into the emergency response business, there's this concept of, the interoperable net and your tactical channels. And it typically, as I think about WyoLink is the radio net that sits on top of everybody else's radio net and allows us all to talk across the state. And when I used it at the Guard, we would talk on WyoLink to coordinate with other agencies, and then internal to the Guard, we would talk on our own nets and on our own radio systems, and that's how we talk tactically. And so there's portions of the state that are trying to use WyoLink as a tactical channel, and it's not necessarily built for that. Some counties like Laramie County has said, hey, we'll use WyoLink tactically, and they've put up some low-level towers, and that's working really well for them. But if you're trying to use it tactically without the right amount of towers, that's where it gets complex. And that's why, Representative Blake, back to your question of, hey, how many more towers? Well, the question is, what do we want the system to do? So as it's built, to provide comms on the roads, we're, these 13 towers plus those extra 2 finishes it out. But if the desire of, the state is more than that, then we need to relook at the number of towers.
Thank you, Director. Other questions? Seeing none, please continue.
Okay, thank you. If you move to slide 3, then a quick update on the revenue information system. As you're all well aware of, we looked at multiple attempts to fund that system last session, and I really do appreciate the hard work that was done across the board to push that over the finish line. So as we look at, okay, what are we going to do now, as there's no funding that came out of that, we will continue to work with ETS for an enterprise solution. And that was very much part of the guidance that came out of the Joint Appropriations Committee, and saying, hey, listen, we want you to work as part of the state, which we would completely agree with and say that's a good plan, and we'll keep doing that. In terms of funding for RIS, the JAC did leave the door open for a potential supplemental, should it be, a system that's combined with ETS. And so I don't think we take that off the table. I appreciated the focus on registration fees, and I think that's probably still a potential option to bring that back and to say, hey, if we increase registration fees by X dollars, then that would fund the ongoing expansion of that system. And the other is, the other always is we could use transportation dollars. I really don't think that's in the best interest of the state to pull money from the road to fund RIS, but I do think that RIS we cannot allow to fail, because the ramifications of that would just be not good.
Representative Brown, please, Director.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, real quick, based off of that, are you talking, if you're looking at raising registration fees, if that's something we look at again, are you looking at a one-time fund it, get it done and over with, or is this a recurrent fee that we're looking at? What's your kind of supposition on that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, yeah, that's a good question. I think fundamentally we would say, hey, let's increase the fee until we pay for the system, and then do away with the fee would be my suggestion. I mean, we're looking for a way to expand the program. And really my sense was that's what the budget had in it when that was vetoed.
Mr. Chairman, follow up.
Director, pardon me.
Follow up, if I may.
Yes, please.
So, Director, I sympathize with that idea. I also worry a little bit about that, because we all know that once government gets their hands on money, it's very hard to let government get away from not having that money. And so we can set it up to where we collect a certain amount, and then that certain amount would drop off or something like that. But I fear that what would happen, especially with this day and age where we're sitting with what we have as far as revenue, declines, I would be a little concerned about asking for something like this from our residents and then expecting that, in a couple of years it would be gone. Because I think that somehow or another, the agency and/or any agency for that matter would find a way to use the money that's coming in from that for something else that is in decline. So, I think if we're looking at this, at least in my opinion, I think we would have to try to look at something that would be once we reach a maximum level of revenue, then we cap it off, and there's no sunset date. It just hits a threshold. Would you guys be considerate of something like that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, we would. I think that the issue is, the request here is, the funding for a new system that we need in the state. And it's not for an ongoing revenue source.
So Representative Brown, would you consider a bill, let's say this committee sponsored and/or you had to sponsor privately, that would say they could raise X dollars, and at that point, registration fees go back to what they were?
Mr. Chairman, that's exactly what I'm thinking. Is once we reach a threshold limit, that sets people's minds at ease that we're not going to continue this on. And then once that level of funding is raised, the registration fees drop by $5 or whatever it may be. I think if you put it in there as a sunset date, or you give the opportunity as an open-ended opportunity for a state agency to continue to have a funding stream, it's going to be very hard to pull that funding stream away from not only the agency, but also our good friends in appropriations.
So yeah, I understand our good friends in appropriations. So Representative Brown, so we can put this on for a schedule in our August or September meeting, whenever that is. And we can talk about that bill at that time, whether we want to have LSO write a bill. So Heather, would you put that on the agenda for, I guess it's a September meeting?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
All right, that'll be fine. Co-Chairman Eklund had a question for
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
It is also, RIS is specifically in the list of interim topics for appropriations.
So can we put on there to consider a bill for this committee, and we'll vote at that time to have you make a bill, create a bill that would fund the RIS system to X dollars, and by then Director Reiner will know how much money he really wants to raise, and it will go back to zero after that amount is raised. So Heather, I think appropriations will take this up, but we also need to take it up as a item on our September meeting.
Okay,
All right, thank you. And Co-Chairman Eklund, you had a question?
Yeah, kind of a statement, I guess. I appreciate that ETS as well as the Appropriations Committee is taking this up. And one of the reasons is for the last, maybe we're the only committee for the last 4 or 5 years that was aware of the need that this system even needed to be replaced. We've never, that I can think of, we've not had a bill that made it to the floor where the whole body got to listen to the idea that this is an important system, and if it fails, we're in a lot of trouble. So I think passing it around through some committees and having other people understand how important it is and understand how it works is a good way to do that. And I think working on a bill, even if it's in conjunction and even if it is JAC that eventually presents it, I think is a good plan by this committee. We're probably the only committee that knows much about the RIS. It's a complex system, but others are being educated. JC is too. So anyway, I kind of like the idea of having other people looking at it hard.
And so, Director Reiner, don't you agree?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, I agree.
Okay, thank you. Continue, please.
All right, thank you.
Other
Mr. Chairman, I think I just finished on the RIS by telling you we are continuing to work towards an RFP and with Math Tech, and that should be in place by this fall. And what you'll see is one of the requests that we've made for the COVID money is to help fund the about $1 million increase and working towards that because there's a lot of COVID related issues that we discovered with RIS.
So, will you have a number for us by September-ish?
Mr.
How much
Chairman,
you raise?
I will work with Mr. Babbitt and with I think the goal will be to have a very good estimate.
Okay, thank you. Please continue.
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
Oh, Senator Steinmetz, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've had some folks with their blue hands up for a while, and so I didn't know how you want to proceed acknowledging folks when they have questions. I think we've done a little bit of both, so I think Representative Newsom has been wanting to speak for quite some time.
Okay, please, Representative Newsom, please raise your hand at that time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a question as we look at this drafting of a bill and having a sunset. I believe with all software, there's ongoing expense, and with the RIS system currently, there's ongoing expense on an annual basis. And how, Director Reiner, would you anticipate if we sunsetted the increase in vehicle fees, how would you anticipate paying for those ongoing expenses that occur with the RIS system? Thank you.
Director Reiner.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Newsom, that's a good question. You probably do it like we are now. I mean, you basically take money from other sources, which comes from our roads. If somebody saw fit to say, hey, we do want to have an ongoing issue, we do have ongoing costs, and so we'll allow X amount of dollars to be raised, that would be probably a point of discussion as we talk about the bill. But you're right now there is no specified funding source for the maintenance of that system.
Representative Crank.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Director Reiner. So as we talk about failure of the system, what are we talking about? If the system fails, does the whole thing just go down, or is it compartmentalized? So a section over here stays up and another piece goes on. I'm just trying to get a handle on what are we talking about as a failure? We got one thing goes down and the whole thing's down, or just pieces go down at a time?
Director Reiner.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Crank, let me answer that to the best of my knowledge. And then I'll ask Mr. Babbitt if he can come on to make sure that I haven't screwed that up. But my understanding would be that it's really an issue of it's old, it's written in Cobalt, and is not compartmentalized. And my understanding is that we would anticipate about the entire system going. But with your permission, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to pass that to Mr. Babbitt.
Mr. Babbitt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Reiner is correct. Depending on the failure, it could be multiple pieces of parts. It could be from anywhere from the network connectivity to just a compartment component, one of the business functions that's written that's not working properly. Whatever went down, we just have to troubleshoot immediately. So my answer would be it could be either or. Chances are it probably could be a minimal piece.
Thank you, Mr. Babbitt. Did that answer your question, Tom? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And Senator Hutchings, please raise your hand if you want to speak. I can see that a lot easier. Yeah, Senator Hutchings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this question is directed at Director Reiner and maybe Mr. Babbitt. Representative Crank asked my number one question. And my second question is, this is the system that we have in the cloud, and maintenance costs are included in this. And I'm assuming with the cloud, they're pretty expensive if this is the system I remember. And then number two, just a statement after the two questions is just last, I guess 2 years ago, we doubled the registration fees. And just wondering, do you think that that's a wise way to go, since many people are out of jobs, have reduced revenue themselves? How are we going to squeeze money out of a turnip? So those three questions, if you don't mind.
Director Reiner.
Mr. Chairman, let me pass potentially for the first two to Mr. Babbitt.
Mr. Babbitt.
Mr. Chairman, the system currently is not it is offsite. It's truly not a cloud modernized version per se. It's mainframe. It just physically moved. They physically moved the location to the Omaha location. So it is basically the old kind of technology, but now it's connected rather than internally on campus. You know, we've got high capacity broadband connections that actually reach to the mainframe per se.
Director Reiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Senator Hutchins, to your last point about, is it wise to raise fees at this time? Ma'am, that is a decision to be made by this group. The discussion becomes, hey, how do we pay for the system?
So Director Reiner, you're talking about paying for the overhaul, not for the yearly updates.
Mr. Chairman, that was my understanding of the question, was the increase of registration fees, which originally we talked about to purchase and upgrade the system.
Senator Hutchings, you have follow-up? Yeah, please take your hand down so I don't see that. So continue, Director Reiner. Oh, we have Representative Obermueller. As soon as he figures out how to unmute himself. You can go to the square.
I got it. Another pop-up got in the way. It was mentioned earlier, Mr. Chairman, that appropriations was looking at this area. I also would like to bring up the fact that the Revenue Committee is also looking at this area. Their priority number 6 is review of fees and leasing rates relative to inflation. And also under their priority number 1, they're looking at the fuel tax. So I think, you know, if in terms of having several horses in the race, it would be good to open up those communication lines with the people on the Revenue Committee also in terms of looking at this issue. Thank you.
Yes, I agree, Representative Obermueller. I think we need to possibly put a bill together and talk to revenue and see what they're doing, and talk to appropriations and see what they're doing at the same time, And so by September, we should know a little more than we do today. So Director Reiner, if you'd like to continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Moving on to slide number 4, talking about grants. This is just a quick recap for you for the number of grants that we've recently received. You know, our team has worked fairly hard and we've had some nice success there. You can see that the Beartooth Highway grant was received, and that project was awarded, and we will start construction here in this month. We did receive a grant, build grant for a winter freight. What that does is that puts in several more parking areas along I-80, which will be a nice addition to that road in terms of truck parking. We did receive another grant then for Rock Springs and for an I-80 interchange that goes over a railroad there. And so that will be very helpful. And then you're all aware that we did receive a grant to assist with the dry Piney Creek wildlife crossings, about $14.5 million there. So we'll put that money to good use. All of those monies, all of those grants mostly have some state match, which is an issue in this day and age. And I'll tell you that the new grants that we've applied for in terms of build grants, we have made the stipulation of either give us 100% or please don't give us any, because
Blake has a question.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, the Rock Springs interchange, could I get some more information on that? And really thankful for the wildlife crossing grant. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Blake, we'll send you that information on the interchange there in Rock Springs. And you're right, the wildlife crossings is a great deal, and we're really happy that came through.
Director Reiner, you're running about 5 or so minutes over, so if you have a lot left, we need to move along.
Thank you,
Mr. Chairman. I don't think you can see my hand. I've had it up for 2 pages. Had it up for 2 pages. Back to page 3. Who pays the registration fees? I thought the governmental agencies were paying that. Some testimony made it sound like it was individuals paying that. I didn't realize that.
No, Senator Anderson, we may run a bill that would register your vehicle. When you register your vehicle, you would pay additional amount to help RIS out. That's my understanding of the bill, to pay for the RIS. So we'd set a ceiling like, 20, 30, $50 million, and that your registration for your vehicle would help get that money, put that money aside for the RIS. That was my understanding of that. So you have other further questions, Senator Anderson? Director Reiner?
Mr. Chairman, flipping over to page 5, let me just talk to you about, we do have a transportation needs study that's ongoing that we briefed you about that we would be doing this year. And really what you see in front of you there is the timeline. What I would point out to you is the end goal is a final report due by next session. But what we see as key is the draft final report to you in December. And we think that's very important to have an outside entity come tell us, hey, what are the funding needs and how should you prioritize them in WYDOT? I think that's important in line with our request for additional revenue, because I think they go hand in hand. And I really wanted somebody to validate, we've been saying we're $135 million short. I really wanted, as the new director, somebody to validate that number for me and to make sure that what I represent and what I ask for from you and from the state is true. In terms of getting us there, we'll start the stakeholder interviews here in a couple of weeks. Both of the chairman and co-chairman are part of that interview process. So the team will be interviewing you. And then the outreach advisory committee will start very, very soon. And that, for everybody, just know, is a sounding board for us to run concepts by as we're proceeding with this study. But again, I would expect to see the results in December. Mr. Chairman, if we move on to the final slide. Which really is the question and answer slide. Mr. Chairman, that would really summarize this brief, this quick introductory brief. I do want to just take a moment to recognize. I'm not sure if you've heard that Ms. Shelby Carlson is retiring from our ranks here, and so during the day, if you'd help me thank her for her service, I'd appreciate that. You know, she's worked for the state for 31 years. 29 of that at WYDOT, and certainly she is really good at what she does, and we're losing a great asset. You'll hear from her a couple times here today, but you know, she's had a very diverse background in service through her DOT experience, and it has showed in the performance of her job as our chief engineer. You know, she's been respected by contractors, subordinates, peers, you know, alike. When you drive over, you know, Togety Pass, you know, just think of Shelby, because she was the chief engineer who put that, she was the engineer in charge of that project. And so you know, that's one of many lasting legacies that she'll leave. And certainly we wish her well, because we're all better because she wore, you know, WYDOT colors. Mr. Chairman, I'm willing to stop there and move on to COVID if you're so ready.
COVID-19 updates and legislative needs. And thank you very much, Shelby. I mean, I didn't hear this until till we had the commissioner meeting. So that was my first. So when are you leaving, by the way?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Actually, June 5th will be my last day, and thank you, Director, and everybody that has reached out to me. The outreach has been overwhelming, so thank you much.
Thank you, Shelby. Co-Chairman Eklund.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be brief. I also would like to thank Shelby for her work. We've appreciated it. And the question I have would be to the LSO. At some point in time in each of these meetings, I would like to have the people who have been to the liaisons to the Transportation Committee meetings to maybe report on what they might have, what they got out of the meetings that would be helpful for the committee to know and give it to the committee. I had a couple of takes out of it that I would be willing to share right now if you think we have time. Otherwise, we could do it when the time is more appropriate.
So Co-Chairman Eklund, could you write those down and hold them until we have our September meeting? And I'll have some information to give to.
That would be fine. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And Heather, would you put that on to our agenda for reports from the liaisons from the Highway Commission?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you. And now we'll do the COVID-19 update and legislative needs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I did make one error. I skipped over one slide on the last presentation. I just need to update you quickly on the e-permitting. I just tell you that it is proceeding as we would wish, and we'd look to have a vendor selected by December of this year. And we do see that as important, and we're gonna keep rolling. It will speed up the processes that are involved in getting a permit to be on the road. And the other good thing that we've discovered is in a pandemic, it's really good if you can do stuff electronically and not have to come in to get your permit. So we're going to keep pushing that along, and there's no major hiccups.
Thank you. Co-Chairman, do you want to speak again, or do you have your blue hand up for obvious reasons?
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. I had it up in 2 places and I need to remember to get it down. Sorry.
All right. Thank you. It's all right. We're all learning on this. So Director Reiner.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you then turn to the PowerPoint presentation labeled COVID-19 response, I'll walk you quickly through that. let me, if you switch to page 2, there's the agenda that I'd like to follow. Let me just start by saying I'm really incredibly proud of the 2,000 men and women of WYDOT and how they've performed during this COVID crisis. They never shut down, and the mission's been accomplished. And there's been a lot of hard work, and I'll walk you through that. As I talk to you through the phases, I'll really focus on really communications, employee care, and operations. But let me just tell you that the guidance we put out at the very start of this COVID, which was really like the day after session ended, was, hey, we will take care of our employees while we accomplish our mission in a coronavirus environment. Those are the 3 guiding principles. And that worked really good on day 1, and it continues to work really good today. And as we make decisions about what we do, how we operate, what we prioritize, where we spend money, you know, what we ask men and women to do, that's the guidance that we follow. So if you flip to page 3, there is some pictures of your WYDOT employees in action, doing their mission in a COVID environment, and while we take care of them. And you can see masks and screens and the other equipment that they have. Okay, next slide. So let's go to page number 4. And what I thought I'd do, Mr. Chairman, in terms of walking you through this COVID is really talk to you sort of about what we experienced during the first, really 4 weeks. And then the last one continues to today. There was some lessons learned, and there's probably 2 pieces of legislation that we would recommend that this committee take a look at in terms of follow-on actions as we'd sort of discovered some things that were harder to do than we would have wished. And so let me just start with slide number 4 there, saying it's for the week of March 18 to 20. Wyoming had 18 cases. This is right after session, and we really didn't know where this thing was going to go. The challenges of that week started really have people starting to think about telework and starting to be a lot of safety concerns from our face-to-face customer service. So that's primarily port entries and driver services. And so it was certainly a confusing time, right, for everybody, and lots of concern about personal safety and lots of employees asking to go home and telework. And so our very initial focus was, hey, listen, we have got to get in front of this issue in terms of communications, because lack of information causes rumors. Rumors are typically pretty bad, specifically in a confusing environment. And no information can just snowball on you, because people start making stuff up, and they get information from a wrong source. And so in terms of communicating with the force, we took some very bold actions that first week. And they're really listed in our operational adjustments 1 through 5. So we created, a dedicated information and synchronization cell with a number that you could call in and an email. So if you've got any questions or if anything didn't make sense, the guidance to the force was call that number, send them an email, they'll work it for you and get back to you. And that worked very, very well. We went to daily COVID-19 updates with the force, and that was the leadership, and probably there's about 80 employees on most of those calls, and it allowed us to share information and then it to be disseminated quickly and accurately through the force. We did stand up a frequently asked questions site on our internal website, and then in addition to having everybody call in, we issued a written notice that went out to everybody in the force. So that was immediately implemented that first week, and that's proven to be a best practice. We also started the process of telework with the focus on high risk. Right, so if you were older, or if you were a cancer survivor, or were any of the high risk categories such as maybe diabetes, we worked to get you out of here. Now, just that whole process, took a couple days to get going. I had to work with A&I, had to sort of streamline the process, but it got pretty fast after a little bit. And my thanks, and you're gonna hear this over and over in here, is my thanks to our IT internal folks in Wyoming and to ETS, because I'll tell you, those guys cranked out the telework computers. Because as you might imagine, it's pretty easy for me to pick up my laptop and go, right? I do that all the time. But for most of our engineers and for most of our employees, they don't travel with a computer. And so getting those computers configured to operate away from a home base here in Cheyenne was a big task. And there's actually a recommendation. Well, we've have now an internal policy. If you can buy a laptop when we replace computers, you're buying a laptop, because you can pack up and go with a laptop. And when you have a desktop, it's a game changer, right? It's in the wrong way. All right, I'm ready to move on to slide number 5, unless there's questions on that initial and that initial on slide 4. Okay, moving on to slide 5. So that's the following week. You can see that now what the numbers of the U.S. are up to, almost 100,000, 70 in the state of Wyoming. And here's now where we start seeing some challenges with lack of cleaning materials and personal protective equipment, or PPE. And then we still sort of worked through, we still had jobs to do in terms of a winter storm. And I'll tell you, the guys responded really well with winter storm, and hopefully it was transparent to you. The roads were cleared like they should be, and there's no issues there. And a lot of issues with employees wanting to go home. And so we, in terms of how we work through that, in terms of employee care, we started increasing the number of people who could go to telework. And this is, it was the following week is really when we started reaching max. But this week we worked through the, hey, how are we going to prioritize who goes out the door for telework in terms of who's our essential employees to get out. And one of our lessons learned was probably sort of have that list going on before an event happens. We also, in terms of taking care of our employees this week, really changed policies in terms of social distancing. So if we, for example, if you're on a maintenance crew in Rock Springs, Wyoming, and you got 12 men and women on your team, then we said, hey, cut that thing in half and stagger when you come in. When you have your briefing, stand apart. And oh, by the way, instead of having to jam 4 people into a YDOT crew cab, I'm okay if you take a couple more vehicles, right? To enhance social distancing. And so that's how we started taking care of our employees there. We continued to push out employees on telework. Thank you again very much to IT and ETS. Comms, really no change in how we communicated with the force. We kept everything in place. And then the other thing that I would share is we started now having to say, you know what, this isn't working very good at our ports of entry, and it's not working very good at our driver services. And we need to maximize some more social distancing there. And the result of that was 2 executive orders that we worked through the governor's office. The first was directly related to our ports of entry, where we said, hey, we're going to waive fees for trucks coming through because that was the national trend. And we needed to speed trucks through the ports to get them to their destination. And it actually helped, because then they could bypass and there is less social interference with our port of entry officers. We also started doing a lot of stuff by phone at our ports of entry and remotely, which is why I'm really...
On that topic alone, did you track how much money you would have received from them stopping or not? Because that could be a COVID-19 CARES Act straight expense.
Mr. Chairman, we can find that number. I don't have it off the top of my head. I'm not sure I'm not sure how accurate it would be. I have to ask Colonel Howard that, and I see he's come up on the net. So let me see what he can add to that.
Colonel Haller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, we did track that, and total was approximately $6,500. And that is to date.
Thank you, Colonel Haller. Appreciate that.
And Mr. Chairman, if I can just clarify, that would be those transporters that were transporting essential supplies to the virus.
So everybody else got through the port or had to stop at the port or not?
So those that needed permits would stop for the permit and pay for it. Those that even were transporting essential supplies that needed to stop would stop. We'd issue them the permit, as the director indicated, oftentimes via phone while they were out in their truck, and then it would be delivered to them outside, and those fees would be waived.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Director Reiner, would you please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So that was the first executive order, and my thanks to Colonel Haller and his crew. Really, they carried the ball on that one. The second one then had to do with driver services, and in the driver services realm, the issue very much was not a lot of comfort in packing people into driver services, and certainly not a lot of comfort in putting people into a car to do a driving test. And so what you saw was an executive order, and this one was modeled after a national model that came out that said, we will honor a driver's license for 90 days after it expires. So don't feel you got to rush in to the driver's service area and get your license renewed. And so that was actually a pretty effective rule. And we also suspended driver's testing for non-commercial vehicles. On the commercial side, we never changed what we did. And so you could have, during the height of COVID, come in and get your commercial license and your test if you wanted. And the focus there was on ensuring that there was basically no slowdown in commercial traffic on the roads, because that's, as Colonel Haller indicated, how our critical supplies, were coming into the state. And so that was the second executive order. Now, a couple of things that came out of that was one, it took us about 3 days of hard work to get that executive order through. And we think there's probably some simpler ways to do that. And that's one of our statute recommendations to you, is to say, in some states, the director of the transportation, in consultation with the governor, would have the authority to change those through rules versus having to do an executive order, and that would speed up the process. And so one of the things I'd ask this committee to consider through lessons learned is, the ability for the director in an emergency, with guidance from the governor, to be able to implement a change rapidly, because right now it was a very cumbersome process.
The director, is this something that Taylor will, or Mr. Rossetti report to us, or?
Mr. Chairman, we will hit that in our recommendation for statutes update in the next section. So that would be a sort of preview of things to come. The second preview, Mr. Chairman, and again, we'll talk this specifically, would be what really hung us up was there in statute is a specific requirement that says to get a test, to get a license, we must know you can see. And you got to go through the visual acuity test. And we could not figure out a way around that because it was in statute. And so what you'll see is a request for us to remove that from statute and put it in rules and regs, because that very specific statute tied our hands in what we could and could not do in terms of issuing a license. I would probably request that we save discussions for those two items till we get to that element of statute updates.
Very good.
All right,
Mr.
Mr. Chairman, that would the other thing I'd add during this time frame is
Representative Brown does have a question for you.
Okay, thank you.
Just a quick one, really quick, Director, and Taylor may have this information. I tried to stay in contact with him as much as possible through some of this, but quick question on issuing new driver's licenses for kids that were turning 15, 16, getting from their graduated to their newer driver's licenses, and that type of information. How was that handled when you guys kind of pulled that back? And as far as like the enforcement mechanisms on those types of, on the children, you know, and I say children, they're traveling back and forth to work or whatever the case may have been, most of them at retail locations. I had a few constituents, I won't say it was an overwhelming a group of people, but a few constituents that were concerned about that. How was that handled?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, I'll just simply tell you that we were not in the business of testing initial driver's license at that time. And so there is about a 6 weeks where we did not do it. So if you turned 16 in that time frame, you needed to wait. The good news is we're back in business almost all the way around the state. There's still a few more sites that need to come back up based on us. One of the requirements is that we need to test you for your temperature, and we don't quite have enough thermometers yet to get every site open. All right, but we're in all the major metropolitan areas and open for business effective last week, and so that's going well. And it certainly was a ripple effect of the COVID environment, was that some 16-year-olds did not get their license when they turned 16.
So you have a lot of backlog right now, Director Reiner, I would think.
Mr. Chairman, correct. We think it's about 900 a month. And so that's, we're in the business trying to catch up with that backlog, which is why I'm so happy we were able to open last week, because we need to start tackling that backlog.
Good.
Mr. Chairman, the other thing I'd add during this time frame is we do have responsibilities for the state under emergency support function number 1, which is emergency support function number 1 in the emergency management world is transportation, and we own it. And so there was requirement to move COVID supplies in certain timeframes, like on weekends, out to the field, and then to collect samples from the field and bring them to the state lab. And so we started doing that process during this time frame, and that process continues to date. And what you see is that's a real direct expense for COVID, for WYDOT, and that was the first thing that we put in for reimbursement for. And you'll see those numbers. But that's our men and women, maintainers, patrol, whoever we have available, out basically doing what we call a relay run, where, you know, materials will go, say, to Rock Springs or Douglas and then fan out from there. Or if it's coming to Cheyenne, people will funnel into those sites and then people will drive down to Cheyenne. And that's worked really well. Let me stop there and see if there's any questions. Otherwise, I'll move to slide 6.
Any questions, committee? Not seeing. Okay. Director Reiner, move on.
Thank you. On slide 6 then, Mr. Chairman, we're into basically the first week of April. And we're really starting to see significantly more anxiety among our employees, largely caused by states around us going to shelter in place. And the guidance in Wyoming was, hey, stay at home. And the guidance to state employees, hey, we're paying you to work, so I need you to be, if you can't telework, then we got to figure out how we're going to keep you, employed and doing your job, because you do have critical functions. And so we worked through that, and I'll tell you, it's pretty interesting from a leadership point of view. Was we actually ended up probably about on 3 very specific Google calls to groups of people and saying, you are an essential employee and you carry a critical function for us. And it's really important that you stay at work and that you're comfortable doing that. And here's how we think we're taking care of you. So we think we're giving you masks, and gloves and disinfectant, and we're putting up screens if you're at driver services. And at ports of entry, we've included, we're now doing a bunch of stuff by phone, and just dealing with those issues directly had huge payoffs and dramatically increased the comfort level. And we modified a couple things that we were doing, but it really helped and helped, really increase the comfort level in those areas and get people back to work. And after taking care of that, there's really been no issues in that regard at all. I would mention, one group that certainly was not affected by that was our troopers. For them, they are used to working in a dangerous environment. But for many of our state employees, when you think about the psyche you do not go to work in a dangerous environment. And we were asking them to go to work in a dangerous environment. And so there's some coaching, some mentoring that goes with that. And so that was accomplished. And I'm, again, really proud of the job that our men and women did. So that week, we continued that. We really pretty much got everybody out who could telework. We were at the maximum. I think we hit about 530. That number sort of fluctuated, around 500, and we're still about there at 500 telework. And so you think about our force is about 2,000. So we're about 25% teleworking. Most of the people in WYDOT cannot telework, right? You can't fix a road through telework. You got to be out there. You can't plow snow through telework. You got to be out there. One other cool thing we figured out is an ozone generator kills things. So we bought ozone generators, both for our transport aircraft and for our trooper vehicles, because if you arrest somebody and they've got COVID, you probably want to clean the rig, right? And so we bought ozone generators to do that. Lots on the operational side. Again, WYDOT has responsibilities on the road. And so we facilitated getting food trucks out to rest areas on the interstate. Lots of moving parts on that, which is probably a 20-minute brief by itself. There is one food vendor out now at the southern port on I-25. And so that's rolling along. And then we did a lot of messaging for trucks using our digital message signs and what we call HARS, or our highway alert radio. All right, so when you see the little sign on a digital message sign that says tune to 1610 or whatever it says to tune to, that's typically our radio. And we put the message on it. And so the messages were, hey, truckers, you got food available at exit 3, pull off and have a Big Mac or whatever was open there. And so that was in place. And then our troopers were really proud to be able to support the First Lady and her efforts to push food around the state. Really no comms, no change in comms. So that's week 3, starting to settle in, took care of the fear. And then if you flip over, well, let me just stop there and see if there's any questions there.
So Director, I think most of that cost, especially the ozone generators, would definitely be CARES Act type reimbursement. So I hope you kept track of those and you have your receipts.
Mr. Chairman, correct.
All right, Representative Laux.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Director, can you just give me a little idea of what an ozone generator is? I've never heard the term and would like to know a little bit about it.
Director.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Laux, what does it do? Well, it generates ozone, and and somehow ozone kills germs. Now, let me just see which ones of my staff could expound on that a little bit more. Colonel Haller's coming on. Thank you, Colonel Haller.
Director. Colonel Haller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Without getting too technical, because I can't, basically ozone machines, as the director indicated, do fill a room or a vehicle with an ozone that kills all germs, viruses, and living cells. So if you put it into an office area, you need to close the door and then actually put a towel or something that will seal the door to keep all that material in there. You can turn it on before you leave the room, but you're not supposed to stay in the room. So in vehicles, we would run it with an extension cord, put it inside the vehicle, close the door, roll up the windows, and generally you want it to work for about 20 to 24 hours.
Thank you, Colonel Haller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Colonel Haller, and Representative Laux. You know, we did, the first place we actually bought them was for our aircraft because we'd actually had an issue about trying to transport some COVID positive patients. And then the discussion was, hey, how do you clean that aircraft? And that's where we discovered, well, here's how you do it. You buy one of these things and seal up the aircraft and close it and come back in a day. So let me move on to slide number 7 then, Mr. Chairman. And really slide number 7 starts on the 6th of April and sets the conditions for where we are today, just in terms of operations. So we, at this point, you know, started to settle in. We did have 2 positives in WYDOT this week. Now, the good thing was the week before we had sort of said, hey, you know, we think we'll probably have some positives. We got people out in the public. We got 2,000 of us. We'll probably have some positives. And so our contracting crew had really worked pretty hard to get in place cleaning contracts for us to be able to clean facilities if that were people who were infected were. And because we looked at a lot of different options, you know, one, could we have a centralized strike team? Then you sort of look at what you got to equip them with and the training required. You know, the state didn't really have anything like that for projection around the state. And so for us, it became, hey, let's let the professionals at cleaning do this. It's actually a way to put some money in their pocket. And really, I think for us, it was a safer, more prudent approach. And so with those 2 positives, the week of 6th April, we were able to rapidly clean the areas where they had been. And my thanks to everybody involved in making that happen because it was very quick and seamless. I would also point out that the effects of rapid social distancing that we took the first week paid off here, because in both cases of our positives, one on the east side of the state, one on the west side of the state, nobody was affected from the work group because the correct social distancing precautions had been taken. And both of those individuals are fine. They're back to work. And the good news that I'm so thankful for was that there is no cross-contamination in terms of our employees. So again, nice job to the troops, right, in making sure that we did the little things right. We started to see really masks starting to be made. I probably should also tell you, and this is probably week 2, and I skipped over this, but you know, when we had no disinfectant material and no hand sanitizers, right? There's just a shortage. Our lab actually went to work and started making it. And so they bought the right materials to build hand sanitizer, and they made gallons and gallons of that, and we shipped it out to our force. As soon as the distilleries around the state started doing that, we backed off because not our essential task, but we did think it was important for us to take care of our own. We had that ability, so we did do that. Same thing with disinfectant. We bought bulk disinfectant and put it in the little bottles and pushed that out to the force. We also, in both of those, would share it with other state agencies if they needed it, and we continued to do that today, specifically with the bulk disinfectant, because we bought a lot of it. The other thing is with masks. You know, we've got people who are making masks, and we are helping to distribute those across the state. So my thanks to our lab for really doing a nice job in identifying, hey, we got the shortage. Our contractors would go buy the material, and our lab would get to work. And really, for the lab, you know, there's a sort of pre-construction season, so we had the ability to flex those employees to take care of ourselves. The other thing I'd mention as you start settling in, you know, you start saying, hey, we probably don't need to talk to everybody every day, and we started backing off. So first we backed off to twice a week, and then now we're backed off to once every 2 weeks, basically on a specific COVID discussion. I talk to everybody every other week anyway. So we talk COVID every week basically. Now our focus is how do we come back to work? Lots of people asking, hey, how do we get back? Our our really guidance right now is, hey, let's not be too much of a rush. Let's just see what this virus does. We're set up, we're working. If you can't accomplish your mission through telework, then we'll work to bring you back in a socially distanced manner but for now, we're gonna maximize telework because we think that's the wise thing to do, and the mission is being accomplished for those that can do it. Let me stop there, Mr. Chairman, and see if there's any questions on that.
Sure. Any questions of the committee? Seeing none, please continue.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. If we go to slide 8.
Mr. Chairman.
Where did that come from? Oh, Cyrus, Representative Western.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and maybe this is a question for Colonel Haller, but you talked about how you're using ozone, which is, it's an inorganic, unstable compound. I'm assuming that there's some sort of safety protocols that come with that because it can be a, potentially very dangerous chemical as well. What's the protocol that the troopers are using right now? Just out of curiosity. Thank you.
Colonel Haller?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Western, great question. So as I mentioned a while ago, we do seal up the area. Let's just use the vehicle as an example. So the ozone generator will be placed into a vehicle, all windows closed, and it would run for approximately 24 hours. From there, it would be unplugged, and then we would be wiping down the interior of the car, meaning the dash and anything else. And then you could also vacuum off the seats and whatnot. Basically, at that point, you're just, you're dealing with dead cells.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, moving on then to slide 8, just maybe going over a couple lessons learned, which again will lead to some statutory and some cost issues. One is certainly planning is essential. We had to work through who essential employees was, and that's a really interesting discussion because essential changes based on the mission. If it's wintertime, snowplow is pretty essential, or snowplow operator. In the summertime, it sort of switches to construction and our construction technicians. And so there's that discussion, and thinking through it once really helped us get ready for the next time. And just in terms of understanding how to clean your office space, we learned a lot of lessons there. In terms of information tracking, I think we learned a lot of best practices in terms of how we communicate with the force. So, frequently asked questions, a number to call, an email to email if you got questions, daily information, all paid huge dividends, and I think kept us an effective force throughout the height of this and as it continues today. In terms of workforce management, the type of computers we have matters. And so I already talked to you about our policy change there. Certainly recommend that's something we look at as a state, because it may not be a pandemic, right? It could be anything that causes you to have to pick to lift and shift, to use military terms, or to move your operation to somewhere else. And if you have a laptop, then it's significantly easier. The in terms of the other workforce management, and we talked a little bit about the fear that was in part of the force, and one of the interesting sort of psychological things come out of here is sort of the meaning of public service, and that it matters, and what our employees do matters. And I think for some it was an eye-opener of, hey, what I do is really important. What I do keeps your roads open or keeps people on the road. And I think when you got to sort of sometimes step back and take a look at what your role is in the force, it's helpful. And so there's some nice discussions that came out of this. And in terms of dedication and commitment to public service, it was an enhancer for that, because you sort of had to think through, hey, why do I have this job? And it's more than just a job. There's 600,000 people in the state that rely on me doing my job, and that's an important thing to understand, I think, in life. As you move on, then PPE, lots of discussions about really we got to have some on the shelf, right? And it stores pretty good. So I think we're going to be in the business of, when it becomes available again, making sure we have some on the shelf. our ability to manufacture and distribute supplies, I greatly appreciated. And with YDOT, we have that capability. And I think for us as a state, we just need to remember, hey, that capability is there and it's a place you can go if you need it. The whole supply route thing in emergency support function number 1 was important to remember and work through. And the work that we did to support really the ongoing efforts will stay with us for many years. And we'll put that into some of our emergency planning documents. And certainly, you know, the whole concept about how do we clean up is relevant, not only in a COVID environment, but in other areas. And then we've already talked about the 2 statutory changes I'd like to make, and we'll hit the details there. Really let me just stop there, because that's really, I think, sort of the discussion of COVID and lessons learned. And then I'd like to talk to you a little bit about really money and CARES Act is next in the COVID environment, based on further guidance, Mr. Chairman.
Questions from the committee? Don't see any.
Okay,
So
thank
please
you.
continue, Director.
So let's go to slide number 9. So that's the average interstate traffic. And this snapshot was taken, you can see the data is at the 15th of April. Now, you know, so it's a 2-week lagging indicator for us. And then by the time we get, actually it's a week. Our information is a week old when we get it, because it takes that long to put together. And then the slides go into you. Today, so you can see that the average interstate traffic on the 15th of April is down 31%. Today, I'm happy to tell you that number's, you know, up to 9,500 in the red line. So it's come up quite a bit. The blue line, which is sort of the average, is also higher, but we're down to about average interstate traffic. The last data we had we're down by about 10%. So that number's coming up, which is good news. All right. If you slip over then to
Mr. Chairman,
Representative Western.
Director Reiner, my apologies for interrupting. So just out of curiosity, looking at that slide, you said it's down 31%. What, if any, what would be the corresponding extension of the life expectancy of those roads? Because obviously, you know, less cars driving, the less wear and tear. I mean, do you have any idea of what that would be? Or thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Western, I think my answer to that would be, you know, it's sort of a blip in time. So it's for a week, it's about a month, and we're about 10% down now. So I think in sort of like road years, I think it'd be very, very difficult to measure. So it's just so small. Because I sort of, my mind went to the same place about, wow, maybe we won't have to, you know, fix the roads as much. But this was the other data that I tell you, and it's not on here because this is just a quick recap, is truck traffic that does most of the damage was down by about 10%. Cars were down about 40. And so where you were doing most of the damage wasn't really down. And this is an average of cars and trucks. Gotcha. So, but it's an astute question you ask.
Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, did we see a decrease in the highway deaths with this month or so that we're down on traffic? I'm sure the traffic on the interstate is about the same as the traffic on the other roads. Or have we seen a decrease?
Sure, Mr. Chairman, Senator Anderson, good question. There was a decrease just because there is less traffic on the road. Now, as we went further on down the line, and Colonel Howler will talk this in his safety update, we did start seeing a couple crashes that were disappointing to us because people were speeding, and they're speeding too fast. And so, but yes, there was a reduction in fatalities. There's this time frame directly correlated to really not as much traffic.
If you flip, Senator Anderson.
Yes.
Okay.
If you flip then to slide 10, really there's the report again, 15th April on our non-interstate, non-highway system. So our, you know, the major highways throughout the state. We're down by about 32%. Now, again, that number has popped back up And we're riding today about 20% down on those roads. And then if you flip over to slide 11, then there's the average state road, non-NHS traffic. And that was down by about 32%. And again, that one's popped up actually today to about a minus 10%. So the numbers are coming back up, which is a good thing. Now I'll tell you that, you know, we're watching this really close because, as you're well aware, you know, our source of revenue is fuel tax. And this was a big hit to fuel tax. So somewhere right now, our estimate is between 10 and 15 million through September this year, reduction in revenue for WYDOT. And so, you know, time will tell where it balances out. It is, you know, important for us, you know, as an agency, you know, to get the economy moving again, just like it's important to everybody else. And so we'll continue to track that. But I just share those numbers. This is probably the worst, and it is the worst, and we're getting better as we go. And actually, Mr. Chairman, what I'd probably be happy to do is send out, we have data as of yesterday, so which is really data as of the 13th of May, and I could just shoot that out to the committee just for your information, because it shows a nice increase.
That'd be great, Director.
Okay, I will just do that. Okay, if we could then move on. So that sets the stage for where we're doing with traffic and money. If you go to slide 12, I'd really like to talk to you about the CARES Act and just walk you through where I see WYDOT relative to CARES Act. Slow on slide 13. In phases 1 to 3 of the CARES Act, there was no specific funding for highway improvements. Right? There was not any. Now there's lots of questions about, hey, you know, if we get some money, can you put some projects to use? And the short answer is yes. And I'm gonna let, you know, as a couple slides down, Shelby will walk you through that. Phase 4 may include some additional funding for infrastructure. If you watch what's going on at the national level, there's just probably a couple key points. One is AASHTO, which is, you know, the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. So think all the DOT, you know, directors or you know, secretaries of transportation in some states are part of that organization. The request for that organization was 50 billion with a B to Congress for phase 4 stimulus to help, and they're calling it a backstop, to help backfill the loss of state revenues, such as you're seeing here in terms of fuel tax. The House last week passed a $3 trillion aid package, largest aid package in the history of America. And in that aid package was 15 billion with a B to state Department of Transportations. The initial projection was about 98 million of that would come to the state of Wyoming. Now the Senate seems not inclined to pass that. And so I don't know, right, where that'll go. And so we'll just stand by and monitor it. The other item, just to really spin you up on quickly at the national level on how it would affect the state of Wyoming in terms of funding for roads is, you know, Senator Barrasso is the chairman of EPW, Environmental Public Works. And he had the reauthorization of the highway funding bill ready to go last fall. And it's still ready to go. And he did a really nice job on getting that thing ready to go. And it helps Wyoming significantly. It's good for rural America. The House really never came on board fully with that. And we have not seen a reauthorization of that act. As it gets closer and closer to election time, you know, the discussion is, will we have a reauthorization of the highway funding bill or not? If we don't, it expires this year on the 30th of September. And so if it's not reauthorized, then we go into a continuing resolution for that act. And that's not helpful. Now there's some funding we get, but it would be a lot better if we knew exactly what we would get, which is what a reauthorization would get. So it's all tied up together. There was some discussion, in the House bill that they would do, maybe a 2-year authorization. So lots of moving pieces at the federal level, and my crystal ball doesn't tell me what will happen. But that's sort of the variables that I share with you, just to tell you that it would be an unclear and uncertain, condition in terms of where we're sitting, and extra money coming for roads in phase 4 of CARE stimulus. And also there's some question right now when we'll get to the reauthorization of the FAST Act. All right, so let me just stop there and see if there's any questions there, because I'm going to switch topics a little bit on the next slide.
Any questions from the committee? Seeing none.
Okay,
please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if you flip to slide 14, that would be some CARES money that did come to the state of Wyoming, and this came from the Federal Transit Authority. So we have 43 transit authorities in our state. So that ranges from, the individual bus at the senior center to our largest one is the START in Jackson, and then the UW bus system. But we received about $28 million in one of the first phases of the CARES Act. $6 million of that went to Casper and Cheyenne by formula, because those are our urban areas, urban here defined as greater than 50,000. And so Federal Transit Authority sent us $6.3 million, and we pushed, and it went straight to those communities. So that's there and done. Then we also received about $22 million for our rural transit authorities. And we sat down, came up with a plan for how to allocate that $22 million. It does not all have to be spent this year, but our guiding principles were, hey, listen, we want to get the employees of the buses back in the buses. We want to make sure that those transit authorities are running and supporting their communities. And we want to pay 100% of the administrative maintenance and operational costs up through September of this year. And we did stipulate no expansion in services or buildings with this money, because the money will go away and then we're left with what we had before. And we thought it very important to reinforce our current operations and to keep everybody working. So that's the plan there. Ran it through the governor's office and the budget advisory team, and we're off to the races with those funds. Let me just stop there and see if there's any questions on that.
Any questions, committee? We could take a break now, Director Reiner. Do you feel like you need one?
Mr. Chairman, a break would be great.
All right, let's take a break. Yeah, I have 10:07 on my computer. So about 10:20, we'll be back. Please, everybody shut off their cameras and mute your mics. 5, 6, 7, 8. We have a quorum. So if Director Reiner, if you unmute yourself, you want to continue?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If we move then to slide number 15, I'd like to talk about aeronautics and the effect of aeronautics on, or COVID on aeronautics. And I'm looking to see if Brian Olson has joined us. And so, Brian, to you, sir.
Thank you, Director. Go ahead, Mr. Chairman.
No, welcoming you, Mr. Olson.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. Can you see and hear me clearly?
Yes, I think so. Everybody else? Good.
Okay. As Director Reiner mentioned, I'm Brian Olson, the Aeronautics Administrator for WYDOT. So, Mr. Chairman, as you're aware, the COVID-19 pandemic has had fairly dramatic effect on aviation across the country and really across the world. And we've experienced that here in Wyoming as well. What we have seen is that the number of people flying in the US has really shrunk to levels that we haven't seen since the dawn of the jet age. So it's been very, very hard on the aviation industry. We've seen about a 95% reduction in passengers, commercial passengers year over year. So we did bottom out in April, and we were right at 95, 96% reduction since compared to April of 2019. Gradually we see that it's coming back, and we're expecting that in May we'll be down about 90%. So what we've seen on the capacity side is airlines had to react very quickly and try to reduce the capacity levels. They were burning through cash at sort of unprecedented levels. For a while, the big four airlines were burning through $100 million a day, and hopefully they've made very dramatic reductions in capacity. So they've reduced that level significantly, which is good. What we saw in Wyoming is that capacity's decreased by about 60% in April, and nationwide it's down about 80%. On the general aviation side, which would be like business travel, and we've seen anecdotal evidence that there's about a 70 to 80% reduction in general aviation traffic across the country. That's a nationwide estimate. So what this has really meant for our airports is that there's been a dramatic reduction in airport revenues, from fuel flowage fees to landing fees, and all the ways that they collect revenue from commercial and general aviation traffic. So some of the things that we've done within WYDOT, we've worked really closely with our local communities and with our airline partner to try to reduce the capacity to better match the demand that had plummeted. And we've been fairly successful in that. It obviously took a lot of work, and the major airlines were working very hard. They had hundreds of changes to make. And so we worked through that in the last few months. And then in the future, we're reviewing this on a monthly basis. So we meet with our communities and our airline partner every month to determine the best course for the next month. So we'll continue to do that. Moving on, that was on slide 16. Moving on to slide 17. Specific to the CARES Act. As part of the CARES Act, Congress set aside about $10 billion that would come directly to airports through the US DOT and then through the Federal Aviation Administration. Of that, Wyoming expects to receive about $49.7 million of really some very flexible funding that can be used for a variety of issues. And that was really the first purpose of that $10 billion, was to provide the airports a way to survive this crisis. That can be used for things like payroll, maintenance, and as well as capital improvements. And then the second item that Congress set aside was of that 10 billion, about 500 million of it was to make all fiscal year 20 federal construction projects 100% match. And we do have a little over 20 of those type of projects in the state for fiscal year 20. So that's a high level overview of the CARES Act funding, and it's very specific to airports. We have been working the last month with the FAA very closely, and those grants are starting to be made available to the airports, and we'll see most of them available over the next week and a half.
Co-Chairman Eklund has a question.
Yes, Mr. Olson, do you have an estimate of what the cost has been to Wyoming, to our airline industry, anything approximate, firm or otherwise?
Mr. Chairman and Co-Chairman Eklund. We have worked on that, pretty specific to the capacity purchase agreement. If you'll recall, that's the project that we've been working on for the last couple of years to really stabilize air service at our airports that are most at risk. So we have been working on that number. Initially, we thought it would be somewhere around the $3 million mark. As we've continued to refine it, and we've seen that it's going to come back probably a little slower than we'd anticipated. We believe it's somewhere around $4.2 million. And that would be the exposure to the state and the local communities. As far as an impact on economic impact and all the revenue that the state may have lost due to tourism and those sorts of things, we do not have that, but we have it specific to the capacity purchase agreement.
So, Co-Chairman Eklund, you have another question?
Yes, sir. A follow-up, if I may. So there will be funding in here for other parts of our airline industries other than the these ones that we're trying to develop. Specifically, I'm talking about the charter industry and other industries that are around the state that are part of this 90, whatever you said, 96, 97% shutdown. There will be money available for those airlines to receive to try to keep them afloat.
Director Olson.
Mr. Chairman and Co-Chairman Eklund. So as part of the CARES Act, the airlines were able, a large chunk of money was made available to the airlines to keep them afloat. And so SkyWest, our main partner, as well as the big four, Delta, United, American, and Southwest, money was made available to them as part of the CARES Act to keep them going through this crisis. So they have availed themselves of that. And I think that they've all taken grants and loans.
Mr. Anderson. Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, I'm surprised there's 33 Wyoming airports. Do you have the breakdown of how many of those are commercial airports and how many are general aviation?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Senator Anderson, 9 of those would be commercial service, and then 24 would be general aviation.
Other questions from the committee? Mr. Olson, I'd like to know, are you still receiving bills from, so we don't have enough employments on the 4 airports, are you still receiving bills from SkyWest, or will they bill you in the future?
Mr. Chairman, absolutely. Yeah, they continue to bill us. Obviously, as the demand and the number of folks that are getting on the airplane go down dramatically, their fixed costs remain the same. And so, the cost per departure of those flights has gone up significantly. And that's where we've really seen an extra cost that we did not anticipate that is really due to COVID-19, through the next few months.
So, Mr. Olson, do you think you could attribute this to COVID-19 as far as the money that, because your track record prior to that moment was really good. It looked like we had a surplus of money and then it just dropped off. So could you say that this was due to COVID-19 that we're paying any money at all?
Mr. Chairman, I think that is exactly correct. Probably our best understanding of how the capacity purchase agreement was working was during the months of January and February in Riverton and Sheridan. And what we saw was really, versus those 2 months in 2019, when we look at the aggregate of what happened there, we had doubled enplanements in those 2 communities. So, and we'd reduced the cost per passenger, in the 50% range. So we know that the capacity purchase agreement was working exactly how we'd intended it. And it was on really a phenomenal path through 2020. And so, yeah, it's pretty disappointing, and we can attribute that directly to COVID-19.
Thank you. Senator Anderson. Yes, Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, the capacity agreement, I'm thinking that we made an agreement with them that they would fly 2 flights or 3 flights a day into some of those locations. If they're not flying the flights, we're not paying the agreement prices, are we? We're just paying it on the ones that they're flying.
Mr. Olson?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Anderson, so what we worked out with the communities, and this is this is a very good question. So what we've done is obviously we've reduced the number of flights. However, the cost per departure, because there's so few passengers flying on that, has gone up so dramatically. I think that our hope is that we can come in below the contractual agreement that we have with SkyWest. At this time, I think we're going to be bumping right up against that. We've worked very hard to reduce the capacity, reduce the cost, reduce the financial exposure. But we'll see what happens as we move through the next couple of months.
Co-Chairman Eklund.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm not sure I got an answer to my first question, and that is, I realize we work closely with SkyWest and those partners, but the state doesn't have much interference with a lot of private little companies that are around the state, the smaller businesses and charter businesses. They are included in this stimulus package that will be distributed. And the second part of that question is, do you have any estimates of whether that stimulus package will be sufficient to keep these businesses afloat?
Mr. Olson.
Mr. Chairman and Co-Chairman Eklund, I know that the CARES Act has a lot of avenues for those folks to, seek and request money. It wouldn't be through us. And so I guess I'm not probably the correct person to answer that question. What I will say is that we've been working on putting together a survey to try to understand the effects on our general aviation community. And we do intend to move ahead with that. As far as whether they'll be able to seek the, funding through the CARES Act in order to stay afloat, I don't have that answer. I think that they would be seeking that funding, not through, we wouldn't be privy to that. It would be through some other part of the CARES Act.
So I can answer that a little bit for Chairman Eklund, is that we can apply for the stimulus package under 1004 or whatever that Senate file or House bill was. We can apply for that kind of money, the 20,000 per business plus the $2,000 for an FTE plus the 300,000. We can apply for those kind of stipends and or loans, but as far as the FAA or any of this aeronautics giving us additional money, that probably won't happen. So we are treated like any other business. So other questions from the committee? Mr. Olson, I think you did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Director Reiner?
Mr. Chairman, so if we flip over to slide 18, we start talking about estimated costs for roads. And there's a lot of questions from many of you initially about, hey, what can we do and what are the options? We did put together a lot of numbers, sent out quite a few emails. And Mr. Chairman, if you're okay taking a little bit of time, I wouldn't mind just recapping what we discovered, because I think it's relevant knowledge for this committee. And if so, I'll ask Shelby really to brief you on slide 18, 19, and 20.
All right, thank you, Director. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. As the director mentioned, we did get a lot of requests for cost data. And so I will just work through that with you and explain the numbers that you see there. start on slide 18. Option number 1 that was requested is what would it cost the agency if we were to add a 3rd lane in each direction for the full length of I-80. So you'll see this one, we did give a 2020 cost estimate, $5.9 billion basically. And then we looked and we inflated it out. We used a 5% inflation rate, and that's based on looking at our current cost indexing that we are using and applying a 5% inflation rate per year on highway construction. That takes our 2022 cost to $6.5 billion. And then our estimate is if we were going to really build this, it would take us about 10 years to do so. Just the amount of time it would take us to get it designed, get it let to contract, and then just to build it while still minimizing really impacts to the traveling public. 2032 costs about $10.6 billion to build a 3rd lane both directions. I've also added the maintenance costs, because these are legacy costs. If we build this out, we have to maintain this additional mileage of road. So $4.75 million additional in costs per year to take care of that 3rd lane. That does include full-time employees. It includes equipment and material costs. We estimate for both this option and number 2 that we would need an additional 29 individuals along with 29 new trucks to put out there on the road. Now we would look at, those trucks and what that fleet looks like. We would probably want to add a few more tow plows. Removing snow from a 3-lane is a completely different ball game than removing snow from a 2-lane. And so we would size that fleet to meet that need. We look at option 2, that was again to put 3 lanes from border to border, but it was to realign the portion from Laramie to Walcott Junction along the US 30 route, or approximately that route. We know that most of our closures on I-80 occur due to weather in that Arlington, Elk Mountain area. This year we had 385 hours of closure through that stretch at a cost to the nation of about $385 million. So cost to build that new alignment along with a 3rd lane, 2022 $12.6 billion. If we estimate that out 10 years, $20.6 billion. And increased maintenance costs per year would be about $5.3 million to take care of that road. Item option 3 was a new 2-lane each direction, just between Laramie and Walcott Junction. Again, just to try to address that stretch. One of our primary missions is to keep those roads open and keep traffic moving. This is a project that would help us do that. So $6.1 billion to build that 4-lane out through that stretch in 2022, $10 billion in a 10-year look to build that out. Would add about $340,000 a year to our maintenance, just because we've been increasing the number of lanes there. If we do look at increasing those 29 trucks, 29 operators, we would have to buy those trucks, initial investment to buy 29 trucks based on $195,000 a truck, which is about what they're costing us now. About $5.7 million to add those trucks to the fleet. And then we would have to build some new facility and storage areas so that we can keep those trucks in. Those trucks don't work very well if we have to leave them setting out and they freeze up. So about $7.4 million to add facilities so that we can house those trucks. So that's the information I've got on that I-80 expansion and partial relocation. Are there any questions on that before I move on to slide 19?
Senator Anderson. Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, I'm interested in.
Somebody have their microphone on that shouldn't.
Mr. Chairman, I'm interested in what, excuse me. Mr. Chairman, I'm interested in what the option 3 cost for vehicles and manpower is. I noticed it's 29 trucks and 29 operators for the I-80 options, but it would seem to me like that US 30 might be quite a bit less than that, maybe more than half that amount of trucks.
Actually, Mr. Chairman, the overall length of 4-lane increases by about 15 miles. And so we would envision, we probably could do it with what we have. We might need one more person.
Senator Anderson?
I don't, that doesn't compute for me. If we're going from Laramie to Walcott Junction all the way through Medicine Bow, isn't that more than 15 miles?
Mr. Chairman, I believe the difference in the existing alignment from Laramie to Walcott versus now the new alignment, there's a 15-mile difference. Now you might be keying in on, one big discussion, right? Is what do you do with the existing chunk of I-80? Do we keep that functional in the summer or when the roads are good? That's a completely different discussion on how we would handle that. And if we are going to keep that, now we've added a significant amount of mileage, like 95.
Does that answer your question, Senator Anderson?
I think it does in her mind, and at some point in time, it'll hit my mind, I guess.
Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Shelby, just looking at going back to the US 30 here, the additional 6.1 billion. How much of that, if we're looking at 10 billion in 2032 dollars, is this what's kind of the breakdown of what the state's going to need to be doing? Is that all state funding? I can't imagine that it is, so I'm guessing a gigantic portion of that's going to be federal. But what's the breakdown of that, and what are we going to be looking at spending, on a state basis? I would guess that the 340,000 maintenance is going to be falling back on the state. But what about the construction?
Ms. Carlson.
Mr. Chairman, we would be able to use federal dollars for that work, and we would be looking at about a 90-10 split. So about, $10 million of that would be state funds. And then you're correct. The additional 340,000 would be all state funds.
So Ms. Carlson, would that be taking out of our, the amount of money that we're given as a state, or separately from the federal government?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure I understand your question. It would come out of our normal federal formula funds that we receive as a state every year that we would then program over there. Now, we could apply for build grants and infra grants to do this work. Sometimes that's advantageous, sometimes it's not, because often our match percentage increases when we get those grants. And so it doesn't make a lot of sense to take a job that we could build with our normal formula funds at a 10% match and get an infra grant that now requires 20% state funds to match.
So Ms. Carlson, would this be, so you do less maintenance or less repair on the rest of I-80 because you were building this?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. We would be pulling money away from our preservation goals that we're working on right now, and the rest of I-80 and the rest of the states and the rest of the highways in the state would feel the impact of us pulling money away to build this. That's correct.
Representative Crank.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Shelby, I'm kind of with Senator Anderson. When I look at option 1, I get it as, my quick calculation is 403 miles times 2 lane is 806 lane miles for 6.5 billion. And then I go to 3, I have 95 miles times 4 lanes, or 380 lane miles for 6.1 billion. So I'm having a little trouble tracking how it goes. Maybe I just need more understanding of just what we're looking at doing there.
Mr. Chairman, so you're asking about the original cost, is that correct?
Yeah, if I look at option 1, $22. So I have 3 lanes each direction. So that's a new 3rd lane. So that's 1 lane on each side. So that's 2 lanes times 403 miles across the state is 806 lane miles added. If I look at option 3, which is Laramie to Walcott Junction, 95 miles times 4 new lanes is 380 lane miles. And there's $400 million difference between the two. And there's less than half the lane miles produced.
Mr. Chairman, the big difference there is we are building potentially a lot of that going to be on brand new alignment. We have to purchase right away. In general, adding a third lane, there will be areas along I-80 when we add that third lane that we're going to have to buy right away, but not in general. If we are building this, we're going to need lots of new right away. Utility moves. We'll have a lot more utility moves here than we would have along the interstate. So you're really kind of almost comparing apples and oranges. And then the other thing to remember is, you know, we would have to completely rethink how that ties in at Laramie, because we can't really bring that right in where it's at. So we either got to bring it in likely to the east and go north around, but that will be a very expensive piece of work there to do based on rerouting around the communities.
Thank you.
Co-Chairman Eklund.
So this discussion is on COVID-related things. How do we tie, I'm not sure how we're tying this change that reroutes the interstate out of Elk Mountain and back to its original route through the desert where we didn't have the challenges keeping the roads open. I guess I need to try to figure out how we're going to justify that as an expense related to COVID.
That's a good point, Chairman, Co-Chairman Eklund.
Mr. Chairman, when these questions were originally requested and asked, there was just talk of stimulus money. We had no idea what that stimulus package was going to look like. There was talk of there being money for highway infrastructure. At that point, we didn't know how it would be tied to COVID. So we're just sharing with you the data that we pulled together. And to your point, I don't think you can tie this to COVID.
Thank you. Further questions of the committee, Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, I'm still back on option 3 with that near US 30. US 30 was improved before the interstates came in with some 4-lane miles. I'm not sure how many miles it is from Bosler to Rock River. And I'm confused why we can't use that same roadway for this expansion, why we have to have a new roadway.
Mr. Chairman, you're absolutely right. Senator Anderson, we would be able to use that at least initially. I think what you would find is that was built long enough that it might have a hard time handling the truckloads now. It's been in place a long time. It won't meet our current standards. So even if we were to go in, we could hold that for a while, but we would have to look at widening shoulders and some of that sort of type of improvements to that road. And there's about, I want to say 10 to 20 miles of that out there in place. You're absolutely correct.
So any other questions from the committee? If not, continue on, Ms. Carlson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All right, we will move to slide 19. And this is just I-80 expansion and putting in climbing lanes. And, you know, when we're concerned about capacity, this is one way that we kind of put in an interim step is to add passing lanes or climbing lanes to help relieve capacity issues. And so this information comes from the I-80 corridor study, master plan implementation that was prepared in March of 2018. So climbing lane, we estimated it's about $4.5 million today, inflated that to 2022 at about $5 million a mile. Increased maintenance cost is going to be around $7,100 per mile. And so as we look through here, this includes 5 new climbing lanes eastbound and 4 new climbing lanes westbound. If you were to look at that report, there's actually 2 more climbing lanes in it. Those 2 climbing lanes will be built on the I-80 winter freight project that is coming up that we hope to let to contract in August. So you can see the different lengths of those climbing lanes, and looking at 2022 dollars, about $68 million it would take to build these climbing lanes. Increased maintenance per year would be about $96,500. This would relieve a lot of impact and help traffic move on these areas where we got steep grades and those trucks get slowed down by putting, you know, the right 2 lanes for trucks only and allowing passenger cars to use that left lane and just relieve traffic impacts there. So we just put this cost together to, you know, this would be a good stopgap that we think would add significant improvement to traffic on I-80. And with that, I'd take any questions.
Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Shelby, just a quick question on the maintenance costs. Does our federal allocation adjust when we build new roads? Do we get additional maintenance costs, or does that all fall back on the state? So it's kind of like a carrot on the edge of a stick there for us, that you keep building roads for us. We'll give you the money to do it, but you guys are going to go broke maintaining them on a yearly basis. What does that look like from the federal government?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, you're absolutely correct. And that is the reason that I have showed maintenance costs. Maintenance costs have to be covered 100% with state dollars. Now, as we're looking at the phase 4 of the CARES Act, there is some discussion in there that they may open that up to help cover some maintenance costs, at least during this COVID time. And that's related to our drop in revenues that we're seeing everywhere across the country. But in general, we have to use our own dollars to maintain assets after we've constructed them.
Senator Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my question kind of dovetails with Representative Brown. The governor has been talking about a 20 to 30% reduction for agency budgets. And maybe Shelby, you can answer this or someone else, but how does that fit into the scheme of things of everything we're talking about today? And how would it affect all of this expansion we're looking at when we're seeing such a reduction in agency budgets?
Ms. Carlson.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Steinmetz, when we look at these original costs, again, they were pre-COVID. We as an agency are closely reviewing our budgets now. We are also taking a very hard look at how we're applying our funds on the state system. As the director mentioned in his opening remarks, we took a hard look at improvement projects, of which all of these would be considered improvement projects. And we have delayed some of those so that we ensure that we are touching the number of miles that we need to continue to maintain the condition of the highways. And so really, to your point, these two are running a little contrary to us having to pull in and tighten our belts in relation to the impacts of COVID.
Senator Anderson. Here, unmute yourself, please.
What a good idea, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. The climbing lanes, 68 million for the climbing lanes fits into that 90-10 distribution also, wouldn't, so that would have cost Wyoming about 6.8 million to get that done. Is that correct?
The other way around. Ms. Carlson.
Mr. Chairman, that is correct.
But Ms. Carlson, once again, this would come out of our 600 million or so we get a year to build these, right? So it's not really additional money.
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. There's no additional funds unless we were to go and apply for a build grant or an infra grant.
Right, thank you. Other questions? Seeing none, please continue. Oh, Senator Hutchings does have a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is, would it behoove us to spend our money maintaining the roads than to keep applying for grants and loans to keep these projects going when we're going to have to just increase the dollar amount to maintain them? This is kind of a continuation of Representative Brown's question as well.
Ms. Carlson?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hutchings, I agree with you. As a matter of fact, if we are putting in for a build grant right now, and it is to do only a resurfacing of about I think it's about an 8-mile section of I-80, and we are not adding any new infrastructure other than just redoing the surfacing on that. And we are requesting 100% money there. And so that would end up costing the state funds $0 if we're successful in getting that grant. With regards to infra grants, the last round of infra grants, we did not apply at all for those same reasons. Our matching dollars getting very tight, state funds very tight. We knew that you know, things were on the decline, and so we did not even apply for any infra grants this time. The other issue with infra grants is they only fund out of infra 60%. They do allow the state to take 20% of other federal funds that we receive through our normal formula funding and put towards that job. And then we have to cover the other 20% ourselves with state funds. The other issue that we have with grants in general is that often we'll, like on the Winter Freight project, we applied for 25 million. They only gave us 20 million. In order to not lose that $20 million grant, we've got to come up with the other $5 million to match that grant. And so it's coming off of other projects that we had planned that we now have to delay. And so those grants can be a double-edged sword. And at least in this round, we are trying not to build any additional infrastructure that we have to maintain as a legacy cost.
Thank you. Other questions from the committee? None. Would you continue, please?
All right, Mr. Chairman, moving on to slide 20. This is looking at 2-lane roadway expansions. Again, this is a request that we received very early on before we knew what the CARES Act requirements would be. But there was thought that there might be money in there for highway infrastructure. So the first question that we got was, what would it take to take existing 2-lane highways and expand them to divided 4-lane highways? So think of 287 south of Laramie. It's built to a separated 4-lane highway. It's not to interstate standards. We don't have to have interchange and those types of things, but that is what this option would build. So it's going to cost us about $4.68 million a mile to do that. Increased maintenance costs per year, going to be about $9,000 per mile. Existing 2-lane highway to a 5-lane highway. So think of the stretch there between Torrington and Lingle, where we just took a 2-lane and widened it to 5. All the work we're doing south of Jackson, 2 lanes to 5. Going to cost us about $3.12 million a mile to do that work. Increased maintenance costs per mile about $13,500 due to the extra lane miles that we're building. And you can see there again, we used we would look at a 5% inflation factor if we were going to inflate this cost out. Maintenance does include an FTE, equipment and materials. We estimate about 35.4 lane miles per truck and operator. And when we're estimating our needs for snow control and snow removal on our highways. So again, we went through then and looked at passing lanes, because in order to address funding shortfalls, when we are having capacity issues on the highway, and we know we have stretches of highway that do struggle with capacity on a 2-lane, we have a difficult time going in and building a 4 or 5 lane. So what we'll do is put in intermittent passing lanes to help relieve that capacity pressure on that roadway, rather than a full width expansion. So if we're building a passing lane in a flat terrain, about $690,500 a mile it would cost us to do that. Increased maintenance costs about $4,500 per year. Rolling terrain, about 1.78 million for us to go in and build those passing lanes per mile. Again, going to increase our maintenance cost to about 5,000. And then mountainous terrain, 2.16 million per mile to go in and build a passing lane. Again, increase our maintenance about 5.5. And that's just due to a difference in terrain. Often that comes with different types of weather patterns. And so that's why you see that maintenance cost creep up just a little bit. Maintenance costs do not include contract maintenance such as crack sealing, chip sealing, patching, and that type of work. This is just a maintenance cost for our workforce to be out there and take care of that roadway. And so that's what I have for you on looking at our 2-lane roadways. I'd take any questions.
Questions of the committee? Seeing none, you must have done an excellent job, Ms. Carlson.
I get better with each slide, right? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Director Reiner.
Thank you so much there, Ms. Carlson. Let me just maybe just take this opportunity to say, again, we have no expansion plans to do with it at all with the material we just showed you. And to the contrary, as we talked about earlier, and like Ms. Carlson just talked about, we are readjusting our plan to ensure we maintain the assets we have before we build anything new. You might hear about it from some of your constituents. They might say, hey, this project has been delayed. And I think this education, hopefully today, will help you answer those questions as you go down the line. This report back to you was very much in response to, we had many people call and say, hey, if we get a bunch of money, what type of road projects could you do? And this is a direct report back to you there. Please don't read into that we're planning to do any of this. Although, boy, I'd love to, right? But current revenue pictures would not allow that. So let me just set the conditions and say that again. With that, then, if you move to slide number 21 and 22, those are really the last 2 slides in this section. And this is the CARES Act funding part of the $1.25 billion. Now, as you all know, the rules are very specific in terms of what money can be used to qualify for this money. And, you know, COVID related, March to December of this year, not in a budget, right? Is the 3 that resonate in my mind. Slide 21 are the projects that we thought fit very easily into those categories. The items on slide 22, the next page, we're still working through some of those details, but some of them, since we put the slide together, we've actually determined there's a pretty good nexus. Now, these slides were put together probably about 15 days ago, and that's a long time in this environment. And so I would ask you basically to we're going to talk, I'm going to ask Dennis Mr. Byrne, to come on the line and talk to you through exactly what we've applied for, because these numbers have changed and some of the items have changed. And so I'm going to ask Mr. Byrne to walk you through where we're at. Mr. Chairman, some of the items that you've discussed going through here already today, we've captured in that submittal. So both Mr. Byrne and I sit on the governor's appointed budget response, advisory team, and so are involved in applying and submitting, requests for reimbursement in this COVID environment. But what I'd like to do is walk you through now what we have actually submitted for to date. Now, there's more to come, but I think we'll turn the floor over, with your permission, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Byrne, and then he'll lead the discussion through exactly what we have applied for.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you and to the committee folks. So related to the COVID and the CARES Act submissions to date, we have submitted 12 proposals totaling about $22.7 million. Now, when I say submitted, that means that we have entered these proposals into the governor's office's spending proposal form that is online. At that point, the budget response advisory team that the director just mentioned will evaluate the proposals and determine if they meet the criteria and then submit them on for reimbursement. So, Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to walk briefly through those 12 submittals. And the first one really has to do with a COVID-related project expenses. We set up a project early, very early in this COVID crisis, related to supplies for sanitizing, disinfecting, counter screens for desktops. It also includes the medical supply delivery that the director mentioned earlier, and ESF #1 across the state. So far, Mr. Chairman, those costs have totaled nearly $300,000, and we have submitted to date about 112,000 of those expenditures. The plan here, in talking with the budget department downtown, is to submit additional costs as they occur and post in our system on a quarterly basis. So all of the costs that are eligible will be posted to the governor's site on a quarterly basis. The second submission, Mr. Chairman, and the director had mentioned this earlier in his discussion as well, is the RFP development for RIS. It's about $997,000. We believe that this meets all the criteria that the director has mentioned and will help us develop that RFP for release for the RIS system once it's appropriate. Third submittal, Mr. Chairman, is for hazard pay, and this is an estimate of what we think we will be paying out in hazard pay once all criteria have been developed around the hazard pay discussion. That's about $1.3 million. Number 4, 5, and 6, Mr. Chairman, all deal with WyoLink, but they differ just a little bit. The first submission for WyoLink is the Quantar replacement, which we had asked for in our exception budget request, which was considered by the legislature in the 20 session. Now, specifically what we're asking for, if you folks will recall, we had asked for a 70-30 split on the replacement of the Quantars. That 70-30 split was based on usage percentages. WYDOT uses WyoLink about 30% of the total usage package, and the locals use combined about 70%. So what WYDOT asked for in the budget session was a total of about $12 million, 70% of it general fund, 30% of it WYDOT funding. So as you'll recall, we did not receive the actual cash approval for the 70% in the legislative session. So we are submitting that to a total of $8.5 million. Moving on to the WyoLink DC power systems, Mr. Chairman, you'll also recall that in the 20 legislative session, all 242 object code requests were cut by 50%. So what number 5 represents is what we had requested in the 20 session for DC power systems that was cut. That equaled about $718,000. Request number 6 is.
May I interrupt you for a minute? What are we supposed to be looking at? A particular slide, or?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, as the director had indicated, slide 21 and 22 had been provided to you folks, but it was early on in the process. So what we will do is send this new information to the committee so that you folks can have this information. So I'll just present it to you for now. And then we'll send it on as a follow-up to this discussion, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to number 6, it's the WyoLink DC power systems. Now, this is the other half of the DC power systems that was approved in the 20 session. But Mr. Chairman, when I say approved, again, we had asked for that based on a 70-30 split, 70% general fund, 30% WYDOT funding. The 70% in general funds was not approved. So that part that was not approved in the budget is being submitted for consideration of the CARES Act funding. Moving on to the next request, Mr. Chairman, it is the Wyoming Highway Patrol WyoLink radios. Again, we had submitted for replacement 1/5 of the total patrol radios during the 20 session. So this actually encompasses the remaining 4/5 of the radios that need to be replaced that were not requested in the 20 session. The next request are for some WyoLink consoles. These consoles, Mr. Chairman, were specifically related to COVID and the development of a safe room for dispatch. We learned quickly that we didn't have a really good backup when this COVID hit, and if there would have been any infections, it very easily could have negatively impacted our ability to dispatch. So since that time, Patrol has set up a backup to the dispatch center. It's a safe room, so it would be to incorporate those backup functions and necessary equipment to meet that mission. Mr. Chairman, that's about $600,000 in submission. This one has been met. The next one, Mr. Chairman, has been discussed previously this morning, and that is the CPA. To your point, Mr. Chairman, there was about $4.2 million in expenditures that was directly related to COVID that we don't believe would have been realized had COVID had not occurred. So that $4.2 million, Mr. Chairman, has been, a proposal has been developed and submitted for consideration. The next consideration was for the patrol dispatch phone system. Mr. Chairman, there was actually a bill, I think, that had been introduced this last session that was not, that did not make it through the legislative session dealing with the patrol dispatch phone system. It's directly related to the 911 centers and how information is passed back and forth. The system is antiquated and is in need of replacement, Mr. Chairman, to be able to dispatch for emergency situations, including COVID-related activities. That is $600,000, that is $1.1 million, Mr. Chairman. And then the last one that I will discuss is some patrol smartphones. This is for about $82,000. And what the smartphones would allow us to do is the troopers equipped with a secure evidentiary software allow the troopers and the evidence techs to pass information back and forth via secured electronics, which minimizes the number of items touched and shared by individual troopers and techs, Mr. Chairman. So we do believe there's a COVID nexus here, and that has also been submitted. There are other submissions that we are anticipating, Mr. Chairman, that we're thinking through now. One example of that would be the weigh in motion scales. And obviously, Colonel Howler had mentioned earlier the lost revenue due to the port of entry bypass. Those things we are considering and developing proposals for to input those into the system as well, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Chairman, unless there are any questions, that wraps up to date what we have submitted.
So, Mr. Burns, would you repeat the RIS system, how much money you're asking for on that?
So the RIS is just specific to the RFP development, Mr. Chairman. That was the only thing that was not addressed in the budget session. It was not specifically outlined in the budget session, and it was for about $997,000 so that we can complete that RFP.
Okay, thank you. Other questions, Senator Hutchins?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Byrne, as I go through this list, I see almost 100% of what you're asking for is not COVID related. These were issues that came up in 2019 or before. And I'm just a little disheartened that we're including these as COVID related expenses. Can you go into more detail about that for me, please?
Sure, Mr. Chairman, we believe that all of the things that are on this list do have a COVID nexus, meaning that whether it minimizes the contact that human beings have, it increases the social distancing, and it certainly connects to emergency response activities within the state, that we do believe there is a COVID nexus, and we do believe that, again, we submitted these for consideration, but we do believe there is a COVID nexus, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hutchings, does that answer your question? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, it answered, but still not to my liking, but that's my personal opinion. So thank you.
Thank you very much. The WyoLink, like in WyoLink, so if you had a better system or a operating system, it would then handle, it'd be easier to access during the emergency. That is one of the things that you can do with CARES Act money, is you can improve your system to handle the next pandemic.
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Further, anything else? Questions from the committee? Seeing none. Director Reiner?
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you, Mr. Byrne, for that rundown. And Mr. Chairman, we'll get you that list. And I think the question to you would be, you know, how closely you want to monitor, because that list will change probably on, you know, 2 or 3 times a month as we continue to submit items. So I think maybe what we do is we keep you informed as we go. In terms of, I think that's your guidance to us, you know, Mr. Chairman, in terms of how close you want to track that and be aware of what we're submitting.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Director.
Bet.
So where do you go from here?
Mr. Chairman, I just saw a couple of hands waving, so I just was, I'm ready to finish this based on any questions that might be out there.
Senator Steinmetz?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would wonder if maybe it would be appropriate, as we see that list, to maybe keep track of what the budget reductions might be as well, as we know that that's coming down the pike, and it might help to have those 2 documents that we're looking at simultaneously, just to see the big picture of the agency.
So the budget reductions you're talking about, or is that as YDOT produces their budget cuts? Is that what you're asking for?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. It was my understanding the governor had requested that the agencies start looking for budget reductions due to the loss of revenue to the state.
That's a possibility. So yes, that would be good, Director Reiner, if you could give us your proposed budget versus this list of items that you're going to email out to us.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senator Steinmetz. The list, our submission for reimbursement will be easy to do like today. The budget cuts still in that process, and so that may be delayed a little bit if that's acceptable, just in terms of not getting ahead of some other decision makers.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman, that would conclude our update to you on COVID and some of the ripple effect, with the exception of some of the statute changes that we'd like to recommend that we will discuss in the next section, the statute updates.
So there's quite a few people that are listed on the updates and legislative needs. You're saying that that'll move, those people will move down to the statutory updates and records. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, say that again, please.
So there's quite a few other people that are listed under the updates and legislative needs on my agenda. Those people will move down to the statutory updates and requests. like Mr. Rossetti is on there, Colonel Kevin Keller is on there, Troy Babbitt's on there. These people all move.
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. My understanding is that list authorizes participation in the Zoom meeting and is not necessarily indicative of who we will have testify from the wide-out perspective.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that clarification. So we have Sheila Furch. Mary Beth, have you let her in yet, or is she here?
Mr. Chairman, she is available, I believe.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
I see her on the phone. Sheila, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. This is Sheila Furch with the Wyoming Trucking Association. I apologize. I was looking forward to visiting with you virtually this morning, but my computer has connectivity issues, and I didn't want that to be a detriment to the process this morning. I appreciate the ability to kind of give you a quick update on the trucking industry during this COVID crisis. I first want to preface my comments commending the governor's office and WYDOT and the Wyoming Highway Patrol and several other state agencies as well for being so sensitive to the industry's needs during this time, as well as being proactive and not reactive. Most of the time when I brought something to their attention, they were already aware of it and already doing work behind the scenes. And I can tell you that was not the case in other states. So we are extremely fortunate to have state government and state agencies that were on top of what was going on during this crisis. I served on the Transportation Task Force, and that was a good way to vet ideas and work quickly with all of us on that task force. So for the governor to do that early on was vital. One of our challenges during this crisis was keeping our members advised on what was going on at the federal level, but in every other state. When you have an industry that has such a mobile workforce, we were, of course, keeping them apprised with things that were happening in this state. But carriers that are based in Wyoming operate in other states as well. And we were fielding questions constantly about, I have a truck going to Texas. Is there a quarantine in place there? Are masks necessary there? Is he going to be able to find a place to safely rest? So that was very challenging at the beginning, and it was good to have a good network of other state associations and a national association that reached out constantly with updates on what was going on in their own states. There were also challenges at the federal level. As Director Reiner mentioned, Wyoming was able to make changes within the commercial driver's license program and provide extensions to licenses that were expiring. That came about at the federal level as well, but became kind of challenging because we had several federal agencies that were involved in that. Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration basically oversees the commercial driver's license programs. However, if a carrier had a hazardous materials endorsement on their license, that was overseen by the Transportation Safety Administration. And there became issues that also the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Administration oversaw. So coordination at the federal level sometimes was not necessarily as quick as it was at the state level, but I do have to give them credit. It was fairly responsive. And that was also evident with the hours of service waivers that were granted for the movement of essential goods and medical supplies. FMCSA responded quickly. However, it was an ever-changing list of what really qualified as an essential good. So there were challenges, but they were met and I think met fairly quickly. There were some specific logistical challenges within the industry. Early on, package delivery carriers became very busy, and yet there were challenges that they had to make changes internally to address when schools and businesses and restaurants closed. sometimes without notice or without anyone going in to check for deliveries. Package deliveries were not made. And so then they had to go back to the package delivery business where they extended how long they would hold packages before they sent them back to the vendor. That also became a challenge because in some instances the vendors were closed. So there were packages piling up. So that was a challenge at the beginning of this crisis. There were changes in logistics for carriers who serviced the grocery end of restaurants, with restaurants closing or limiting what they could process for food delivery or takeout. Those loads changed. And so while grocery store business was greatly impacted positively, the restaurant delivery business was changed a lot. That also happened in the waste removal. When you have restaurants and businesses and schools that no longer are producing a lot of trash or waste, those carriers had to change their operation. We as an association worked closely with a WTA vendor member within the first week of the crisis, who was working with a local distillery and had found product that they needed to make the hand sanitizer, but it was in Georgia. So they turned to us to help try to find carriers that could help bring that load from Georgia. Fortunately, they were able to find that product in Denver, so it became a much easier logistical question about how to get that product here to Casper. We also worked over the Easter weekend with carriers to try to find refrigerated units to help in First Lady Gordon's hunger initiative to bring food products from Salt Lake to Casper this past month. And we also have members whose business may have downturned because of the crisis, and they were more than happy to try to reach out to find other ways to help bring loads of essential services. So it was gratifying to see the industry come together so quickly and so dramatically to address the needs that this nation had. So a handful of states waived their size and weight limits. That wasn't necessary in Wyoming. Most of the states that did that are states that have interstate limitations at 80,000 pounds. And so Wyoming is over that. That did not become necessary in this state. The expedited port stops and the permit waivers for essential goods that WYDOT and Highway Patrol implemented, that was remarkable. That wasn't done in a lot of states yet. It was very helpful to those carriers that were hauling the essential services. There were food challenges when early on there were some states that were actually shutting down truck stops, which included shutting down the restaurants within those truck stops. And when you have an employee that is on the road, and that is where they rely on to park their vehicle and get their required rest and eat, that became a real challenge. The National Truck Stop Association responded to that and worked very closely with some of those states to explain how necessary it was to keep those truck stop restaurants open, at least for carry out or delivery to the trucks in their parking lot. I think the director also mentioned that there was an effort to bring food trucks to the rest areas, and that was very important in a lot of states. I know we have one food truck operating here in the state. Some states initially reacted to the situation by closing their rest areas. And again, that had a huge impact on the trucking industry. Drivers rely on those rest areas to get the required rest breaks. And so that was something that, again, we were very happy working here in Wyoming, because that was never even considered. WYDOT also made the decision to extend the registration expirations on IRP and IFTA, and that was certainly helpful. We were one of the states that our motor vehicle service offices did not close. There were a lot of states that did. And so extensions on registrations as well as driver's licenses were imperative for those states where drivers did not have access to extend their driver's licenses as they were expiring, and companies did not have the ability to pay and process their registration fees. So those extensions became very important for the industry. Recently, the American Transportation Research Institute did a quick survey, and I just wanted to highlight a few of those. The freight movement right now is both volatile and depressed, depending on what part of the sector you are in. Trucking activity right now is generally suffering, except with the exceptions of truckload carriers who are hauling essential goods and medical supplies. There's a huge demand for refrigerated units and dry vans. However, carriers who operate flatbeds and tank trucks are being heavily adversely impacted by this. The trip lengths have probably been reduced, but the ability for trucks to make up time by increased speed limits just because of dramatically lower traffic congestion levels in a lot of the states. When you don't have other vehicles on the road, trucks have been able to go through a lot of the choke points in a lot of the states, still driving the speed limit, but certainly driving faster than they normally can through those choke points. Excuse me. Truck parking, again, while that's always an issue for the trucking industry, did seem to be exacerbated during the COVID situation. And one of the other things that the ATRI survey noted in one of their footnotes was that a key metric right now shows that while there's surging demand amid coronavirus, it doesn't necessarily correlate to increased profit for the trucking industry. And to close, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to give you some figures that I found in a report in one of the industry magazines that references a May 8th Bureau of Labor Statistics report. I apologize, I don't have corresponding statistics just for the state of Wyoming, but 88,300 jobs disappeared in the truck transportation sector in April. That's a 5.8% drop from March, and that's a 6.2% year-over-year decline. Of course, not all of those are drivers, but most probably are, just that given the fact that about 60% of trucking payroll jobs are commercial drivers. And they said the closest that this degree of job loss was is a 4.2 reduction in 1994 due to a Teamster strike against 22 trucking companies. And the biggest decline other than that outlier was a 1.9% reduction in January of 2009. This April decline this year sent trucking back to the industry employment level of September of 2014. And I think most surprisingly is that as late as February of this year, the industry was only 0.5% off its all-time high, which was in July of last year. So in just 1 month, trucking has shed a bigger percentage of its payroll force than the industry's 5 worst consecutive months of the Great Recession. Most of those numbers do not include private fleets. Those are only firms that are hauling for hire. But on a positive note, parcel and local delivery added 1,800 jobs in April. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to take any questions. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to give you this information today.
Thank you, Sheila. Representative Brown does have a question.
Just a quick question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sheila, you mentioned at the very beginning some of the areas across the country that have released restrictions. Maybe we saw some restrictions in this state that may have helped the trucking industry, helped our economy rebound a little bit quicker. Is there any of those restrictions that you have seen that have been relaxed just within the past 2 months that have made the industry more maneuverable and having less government oversight that you have seen that would be a benefit to keep in place in our state at this point? Is that something that we should be looking into for our next meeting?
Ms. Search.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, thank you for that question. Most of the restrictions that happened for the trucking industry were the extension of deadlines or waivers of hours of service. Of course, we're always interested in the hours of service issue, and I think FMCSA has recently issued proposed changes to the hours of service regulations, and I think some of the things that we saw happen with some of the relaxing of those during this time frame will bode well for further discussions at the federal level. I think with WYDOT being able to handle some of the things through the ports of entry differently, I think those are definitely up for discussion, but may not be at the point that we would be ready to discuss statutory changes on those. But it's certainly something we want to be in discussions with, because I think there will be some things that will just change how we do business.
Thank you, Ms. Furch. Appreciate it. Any other questions from the committee? Seeing none. You got off easy, Sheila.
I did. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for coming. Director Reiner, I do have a couple of questions.
Yes, sir.
Management Council assigned us some topics related to COVID, which all fell on WYDOT. But there's about three that a couple of them you're going to take up in the next statutory changes. But there's a couple that have not been addressed this morning, which is emergency access highways to critical care hospitals. Have you looked at that, or have you worked on that, or you even thought about that?
Mr. Chairman, my understanding on that was that went back to the sort of the discussion on, hey, what could you build? And that was a discussion of what would be the relationship between a road and COVID. And so when the debate was, hey, we might give you money to build roads, but it's got to be COVID related. That was the idea that had been floated was, hey, if we can improve the road that goes to a hospital, then there's a relationship to COVID. So, Chairman, that's as far as we took it. There is no money coming for roads, and so we have not pursued anything more on that. And really, that's where we sit today.
Well, it seems like one area that you probably could get reimbursed for, but I'm not sure of that. The committee, any other thoughts? I do have another one to ask, which is WYDOT emergency support function reimbursement for COVID related expenses.
Yeah. So, Mr. Chairman, and when we talk about emergency support function number 1, and the fact that that was the first item that we submitted, we've spent it about 115,000 so far. We've spent about 300K, and we'll submit a quarterly reimbursements for that. So, Mr. Chairman, we think we've taken care of that issue, and I would say those costs are being captured and tracked very well and submitted for reimbursement on a quarterly basis.
So the last one is the reimbursement for additional temporary employees put in place because of COVID-19 to cover required services to the public, which would probably be the registration and or the driver's license part of it would make you hired temporary employees to fill that. So Director Reiner, do you have any comments about that?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. We did look at that, and the discussion, and that was an idea that it originated, and it was a good idea. As I kicked that around with Mr. Rossetti and Ms. Dobson, who runs that section for us, that is a very technical section, and it's very difficult. You can't hire a temporary and have them do that job because of all the rules and laws associated with driver's license and driving. And when we started talking through that, we said, hey, you know what? Let's just work to get people back on the job as quick as we possibly can. And so we opened up for driver services last week. And Mr. Chairman, right now, at this point, unless another disaster befalls us, we think in the end it's probably better that we deal with the backlog from 6 weeks of about 30% activity with the current force and not go down this road. If we think we've made a bad decision there, I think we come back to you. But right now, the request from the force is, hey, let us deal with the backlog with the force that we have because they're trained. And by the time we get somebody hired and trained, probably this backlog will be gone.
Chairman Eklund, do you have a question?
Not concerning this, I guess just in addition, one of the topics that Management Council wanted us to be clear on is coming up, and it addresses the trucking industry. And so if Mrs. Firsch had anything more to add, she might stick around. Thank you.
So you're talking about number 4, the statutory changes to address trucking, aviation, and railroad issues. I think we've done aviation and trucking. I don't know about railroad issues, but WYDOT generally doesn't have any oversight over railroads, but I don't know that.
Yes,
Director, do you have any comments?
Mr. Chairman, in terms of statutory changes for truck and aviation and railroad, right now, none have come to our attention. If those industries and the industry representatives would like to suggest some, we're all ears and would certainly support them if we think applicable. But at this point, as Ms. Firsch said, I think we're pretty good in where we're sitting in terms of current statutes relative to those industries.
Thank you. Senator Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is just regards to the upcoming section, the statutory updates we're looking at, and the workload that we've been given with regard to the COVID and the new updates from Management Council. Are we planning to kind of pare those down? As we heard in this first section, this situation has changed a lot of what our impact is as far as what we consider with regards to new lanes and all of that stuff. And so I was hoping that we had considered maybe what we needed to pare down in order to conserve our time and the taxpayer dollars that it takes this committee to look at all of these issues. I mean, have we considered that before we delve into this next very long session of the agenda here? Thank you.
So Senator Steinmetz, are you asking a question as to us paring down what Management Council gave us? Or are you talking about paring down what they're presenting on this regulatory statutory?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'm talking about paring down the statutory updates as far as, you know, maybe at least prioritizing what we want to look at, because that's pretty extensive as far as what we had proposed before COVID hit and now what we're looking at. I mean, there's a lot. I don't know, I counted around 20 items it looked like in that statutory update. So I just wondered how we were going to handle that.
Well, I was going to let WYDOT give us the statutory updates, and then we would decide what we'd want to make a bill out of. And so, Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, the length of the meeting today doesn't cost the state any more or any less. It's going to be the same cost whether we go till 4 o'clock or midnight. So we won't save any money by hearing fewer statutory requests.
Thank you. Co-Chairman Eklund.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I think this is for the director. I'm curious, you know, as we try to consolidate some things, the statutory updates, can the 3-axle truck issue that we're coming into that's, I think tomorrow, or it's late today, I can't remember for sure. Can it be inserted into these statutory updates as well? And And if you don't know the answer, maybe as we go through it, somebody might be able to figure that out.
Director Reiner?
Yep, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, in terms of the 3-axle truck, that was not our topic to bring. We are supporting somebody else. We would, if we wanted to bring it forward today, we'd listen to the testimony, but that was not a YDOT statutory issue. Mr. Chairman, if I could maybe relative to the request for Senator Steinmetz in terms of quantity, as we tracked it and as I looked at that, the taskings from the Management Council to the Transportation Committee, my sense was that we added 2 statutory recommendations from that Management Council list to the list, and they're in there as we speak. The rest of the items, I think we have very much taken care of. So you just tasked me to relook at emergency access to highways. The issue with that one, Mr. Chairman, is that the money has to be spent this year. And so unless there is a significant project lined up to do for an access to highways, that was trying to spend, dollars on roads. And that one struck me as a great idea, but I'm not sure how we execute it. And then you slip down to the emergency support functions, that's done. And I would say, check it off because it's occurring and that's happening. And then in terms of temporary employees, my recommendation is we not do that. And then the authority for Wyoming, the emergency statute authority is part of the statute increases. So my sense was not a lot of addition. And I think there'll be some looping and grouping that we can do in these statute updates.
Thank you, Director. Ms. Jarvis, did you have something?
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to comment about the 3-axle truck topic. For that has additional speakers, as the director said, and I know that they are prepared to appear tomorrow. So I don't know that it would be easily moved onto today's quite packed, busy schedule.
No, I thought it would be tomorrow too. Senator Steinmetz, do you have something?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to further explain my comments. This year, when we were working through the budget, we had to increase our LSO staff budget quite a bit, and we all agreed it was because we had trouble restraining how many committee bills that we sponsor and all of those things. And while today, it may not cost us any extra to go through all of these topics and all of that, just moving forward and with the extra workload and the extra special sessions from COVID related items, I think we have to be extremely cautious in what we choose to take up and make sure that we're addressing the first things first, as everyone would say, just because we have piled an extra burden on our staff. It's amazing the work they did in that special session, staying up all night long. I really respect and appreciate all of them. And so I think we just need to be cautious as a committee that we don't overburden our staff in this time of increased workload already. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Steinmetz, you said it well. And so we won't try to get a lot of bills out of here, but if we can make one statutory change or one bill that only changes 4 or 5 statutes, and we can label it as one bill, that would be a lot easier because I know Mr. Rossetti's done most of the work. So thank you. And LSO staff is just incredible the way they worked that last special session. So Director Reiner, do you have anything else for us?
Mr. Chairman, negative as it relates to COVID.
Okay. Amanda or Mary Beth, do you have somebody sitting out in the room waiting to come in to comment on this?
Mr. Chairman, there is no public comment, and I believe all of the presenters on this topic have been added to this meeting.
Okay, thank you very much. So it's 7 minutes till 12. Why don't we take a lunch break and come back for the statutory updates and reports, which is supposed to be at 11:30. So we're not that far behind. Let's come back at 20 minutes till 1, and take it from there. So please turn off your cameras and your microphones.